Hello readers by eyes and by ears, this is Mari Chan and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are continuing with the reading of Stars of Chaos Volume 5, also known as Chapeau by Priest, and I'm letting you guys know it is a long one today. I was really in the zone, so we are covering 5 chapters. Anyway, I hope you all sincerely enjoy because this is jam-packed with a lot. Chapter 122, In Dreams. In the course of a person's life, there were always those moments where they felt their heart could fit nothing aside from a single absurd desire, a yearning so strong it could devour their soul in a single gulp. At such times, no matter how desperately rationality scrabbled at the sealed door of their mind, it would be ignored. Like how years before, when Guyuan's mind had been fever-boiled into a bowl of slop in the barren lands of the Northwest, his only thoughts had been of quitting his post and relieving himself of his duties to wander the ends of the earth. And like how now, years later, as Chang'eng trudged out from the innermost halls of the palace into a light flurry of snow, he could think of nothing but his desire to see Guyuan just once, far away as he was on the other side of the nation. Chang'eng remembered little of his rush back to the Marquis estate. A pair of iron puppets standing guard at the gate turned to silently watch his passage. As he glanced into one of the puppets' glowing purple eyes, he came to a halt. He stared at those iron monsters for a long time, as if slowly awakening from a dream, until he finally began to surface from his state of near madness. He set his hand lightly on the puppet's icy cold arm, let his shoulders slump, and breathed out a frustrated sigh in a cloud of white steam. He had parted and reunited with Guyuan countless times. For a stretch of 4 years, they hadn't seen each other even once. Yet none of their separations had felt as torturous as this one. Chang'eng didn't know whether he was becoming more delicate with age or whether his insatiable appetite for Guyuan was simply growing. He felt there was a string in his heart that had been winching tighter and tighter since he'd received Guyuan's letter saying he missed him out of the blue. With every new hair-raising military report that reached the capital from the south, with every new twist and danger in the political situation in court, that string had pulled tighter, until now it had snapped without warning. The gate swung outward to admit Huodan, the captain of the Marquis Estate's guard. He was shocked at the sight of Chang'eng. "Uncle Wang asked me to find you. Your Highness, what's wrong?" The rims of Chang'eng's eyes were red, but he simply summoned a faint smile to his lips. He straightened his spine and dusted the snow from his shoulders. "It's nothing. I'm a little dizzy because I walked too fast. Does Uncle Wang need me?" Huodan wasn't the most sensitive fellow, and never suspected Chang'eng might have spoken anything less than the truth. He stepped forward to take his arm and said low, "We have a visitor who requested discretion. He says he has urgent news to report. He couldn't petition for an audience at the Grand Council, so he's come to the Marquis estate." The visitor was a man in his mid-30s. Despite feeling that he'd seen his face, Chang'eng couldn't immediately place him. He rapidly smoothed his turbulent thoughts as he combed through his memory for the visitor's identity. Fortunately, the man saved him the trouble. "This lower official is Liu Zhong, Assistant Supervisor of the Foreign Affairs Mission. My greetings to your Highness." The so-called Foreign Affairs Mission was the project of a number of hardcore pacifists in the Ministry of War who had at some point joined forces with others in the Imperial Court of State Ceremonial. Fearful of offending the long-gone emperor, they didn't dare call themselves a peace envoy and could only stamp the vague title of Foreign Affairs Mission on their foreheads. Under the guise of promoting civil and military cooperation, they requested their members' deployment to the front lines on the bullshit pretense of dispatching their enemies through alternative means. What they were actually doing was creating a larger headache for Guyuan. Chang'eng frowned. His impression of this group was far from positive, but he squashed any displeasure under his usual elegant demeanor. He offered the man a small nod. "Supervisor Li must be about to depart. What urgent business brings you here so late at night?" Liu Zhong stepped back and sank to his knees, then raised the palm in the air as if swearing an oath. "If this lower official speaks a single word of falsehood tonight, may I be struck by lightning from the heavens and my parents rest uneasily below the 9 springs." Chang'eng took a quick step to the side. "Supervisor Liu, what are you doing? Please rise." Liu Zhong shook his head. Your Highness, are you aware that the supervisor of our mission, this lower official superior, was once a student of Grand Secretary Fang? Of course Chang'e was aware. He had been disgusted with this supervisor for quite some time. If he weren't so tied up in other affairs, he'd have dragged these treacherous sycophants in the foreign affairs mission out one by one and subjected them to a slow and painful death. Your Highness, please listen. Liu Zhong quickly divulged the secret instructions Grand Secretary Fang had given his superior. He stressed, "Only a few of my superior's closest confidants are aware of this. This untalented lower official happens to be among them." Chang'e tapped his finger on the low table at his side. "Spilling secrets at the Marquis estate in the middle of the night is not the conduct of a close confidant, is it?" Liu Zhong dipped into a deep bow. "My family hails from Hangzhou, and my birth parents passed when I was young. I was raised by the elders in my family and later traveled the nation as a wandering scholar. I served as an advisor in the houses of marquises and dukes, and thanks to a fortunate encounter, caught the eye of the Fang family patriarch, who recommended me for official service. The debt I owe him is difficult to repay." Chang'e raised a brow. "I had an innocent childhood sweetheart in my youth, and we were engaged but not yet wedded." Liu Zhong hung his head, his shoulders hunched. "I planned to return home and ask for her hand properly when I made a name for myself. But before that day could come, she was assaulted by a nobleman." Liu Zhong wiped at his face and kowtowed, pressing his forehead to the ground. "Although the deceased are dead and gone, the living hold onto their regrets. Your Highness, I beg your sympathy." Chang'e sighed. "Supervisor Liu, rise, let us speak." Their quiet conversation continued long into the night. When Chang'e finally saw Liu Zhong to the gate, the clapper of the night watch was already sounding through the streets. Chang'e lingered for a while, pinching the space between his brows, then turned to Huo Dan. "Captain, please check if Miss Chun has retired for the night. If she hasn't, I'd like to see her." Chen Qingxu had been occupying the guest room at the Marquis estate in preparation for her attempt to cure Chang'e's wu'erge. But it was sure to be a lengthy process, and Prince Yan was always busy, only leaving the palace to return home once every 10 or 15 days. Chen Qingxu detected something off in Chang'e's complexion the moment she saw him. "Your Highness, the heavier your heart grows, the more difficult it will be to control yourself. Have you been getting enough rest?" The laugh that escaped Chang'e was a grim one. He had intensified the conflicts in court ahead of schedule and hadn't had the time to take proper preparations for everything. Every step he took was as treacherous as if he walked along the edge of a sheer cliff and might find himself stepping out into empty air at any moment. But he was out of time. He feared his enemies would strike at any moment. More than that, he feared Guyuan was reporting all of his successes and none of his failures, suffering some unknown hurt where he couldn't see. "Miss Chun," Chang'e said, "if it's convenient for you, why don't we begin treatment today?" Chen Qingxu was startled. "The process may be very painful. You're busy with your work in court every day. Will you be able to handle it?" "I don't know." Chang'e shook his head. "But I have a bad feeling about all this. Every day I feel less able to suppress the poison. Perhaps it is time for drastic measures." 2 hours later, Chang'e discovered he had underestimated what Chen Qingxu meant by painful. Chen Qingxu handed him a bowl of medicine and went to prepare her acupuncture needles. "What is this?" said Chang'e, accepting the bowl. "When you're no longer ensnared by the wu'erge, I will give you a copy of the prescription," Chen Qingxu said. "But for now, it's best if you don't ask." Chang'e stared back at her mutely. He didn't know why, but to him, everything connected to barbarian poisons stank of corpse oil. Her words seemed to pluck at a web of unpleasant connections in his mind, and he immediately swallowed his questions. He curled his tongue, pinched his nose, and downed the bowl in a single large gulp. Chen Qingxu leaned down to light a stick of pacifying incense, allowing the cool, sedate fragrance to disperse throughout the room. She sat down a few paces from Chang'e, her face stern. "Your Highness, once I begin the acupuncture treatment, you must maintain clarity of mind and spirit. If you succumb to the madness, no one will be able to wake you. Do you understand?" Chang'e nodded. "Once this stick of pacifying incense burns out, I will begin." Chen Qingxu continued, "Your Highness, please use this time to clear your mind of any distractions." He felt nothing at first. Chun Shu was steady and accurate in her needle placement, her movements deft. Chang'eng closed his eyes and relaxed under her hands, but as she continued to work, a wave of cold terror rushed up his spine. He felt as though someone had raised a lethal weapon over his head and it was too late to move. He had no choice but to close his eyes and wait for the blow to fall. All the muscles in his back tensed, a subconscious attempt to dodge despite his helpless immobility. Chun Shu couldn't place any more needles. She straightened, a grim set to her mouth. "Your Highness." Chang'eng felt an invisible whip crack across his back. A roar filled his ears, a decade's worth of curses in a woman's voice washing over him at once. Drowning in bygone nightmares, he smelled the pacifying incense and heard Miss Chan's words cut through. "Your Highness, you're in the Marquis estate. Can you hear me?" He shuddered, mustering all his remaining strength to give her a weak nod. Chun Shu placed the next needle. Noting that the second stick of pacifying incense had burned out, she glanced at the Western clock on the table. "This is only the beginning. Your Highness, do you need a moment before we go on?" Chang'eng bit lightly on the tip of his tongue. "No, continue." She said no more as she applied the rest of the needles at top speed. The visions that had receded surged back with a fury. Every cut and bruise Xunyang had inflicted on his youthful body flaring to life one by one. Brows knit, Chun Shu watched as an old scar over Chang'eng's collarbone turned red and swollen, seeping beads of blood as the spider web of vessels surrounding it burst beneath the skin. A terrifying sight. "Your Highness!" There was no reaction from her patient. Chun Shu's hand stilled, afraid to continue. Her eyes snagged on a set of iron pauldrons hanging at the foot of the bed. They looked dated. The military had long since changed to a different style. Chun Shu abruptly recalled a long-ago conversation with Chang'eng about the symptoms of the wu'er. He had casually mentioned that the first time he escaped from the grip of its nightmares, it had been thanks to some pieces of armor Gu Yuan had hung at the head of Chang'eng's bed. Chun Shu's arm shot out with a sweep of her long sleeve, and the iron pauldrons clanged against each other with a crisp, melodious sound, echoing through the quiet room. Chang'eng's ragged breaths paused. Layer upon layer of hallucinations arrayed themselves before his eyes. He was trapped in the body of his childhood self. The sharp point of a hairpin, a red-hot poker, a dirty horsewhip, a woman's hands, nails sharp as iron claws. And at the very end, Gu Yuan, half clad in a suit of iron armor, silently watching him across the distance of years. Chang'eng fixed his eyes on him like he was his last hope, clinging to his final thread of rationality. After what might have been ages, the menagerie of demons and ghouls surrounding him slowly fell away, and Chang'eng came back to himself with a bone-deep exhaustion. The pacifying incense on the table had burned out, and Chun Shu was putting away her acupuncture needles. He discovered, belatedly, that he could move again. "How do you feel?" Chun Shu asked quietly. Chang'eng flexed his arm, spotting a new thicket of fine scrapes on his skin. They had scabbed over already and itched a little. He experimentally closed his hand into a fist. "Like I dragged myself out of it all over again." After bidding Chun Shu farewell, Chang'eng collapsed into bed and slept. His sleep had always been like a still pond, easily shattered by the disturbance of a single pebble. Aside from the incident in Jiangbei, when he had lost too much blood, he rarely lost consciousness so totally. Yet tonight, not only did he not stir, he slept for the first time without nightmares. Instead, he dreamed he stood at the foot of an observation tower looming high in the air. Fires burned in the distance and soldiers stood on guard within the garrison. The atmosphere was oppressive, as if everyone slept with weapons beneath their pillows. Chang'eng watched a group of soldiers return from patrol, tugging on their horses' reins to bring them to a halt. Suddenly, their leader looked back in Chang'eng's direction. It was Gu Yuan. Wearing a glass monocle more garish than any ornamental mask, he threw Chang'eng a teasing smile, silver filigree glinting atop black iron armor. In the dream, a laugh bubbled up from Chang'eng's throat. "What the hell are you wearing?" Gu Yuan reached down from his seat atop the horse with one violet gold powered arm and pulled Chang'eng up to sit in front of him with an effortless tug. He looped his arms around Chang'eng's waist and laughed into his ear. It's lonely in the army. I thought I'd seduced a beauty or two. It was always difficult to hide the fluctuations of one's emotions in a dream. Though he knew Guyun was joking, Chang'e felt a wave of hurt. I've spent countless sleepless nights in the capital, afraid to take a single misstep. All I hope for each day is a single word from you, yet it never arrives. Your Highness, did you come all this way to throw a tantrum? Guyun asked helplessly. Chang'e feared he had a point. He yearned to mimic those popular storybooks and make all sorts of unreasonable demands of Guyun, but like a scholar realizing his studies were insufficient only when it came time to apply his knowledge, he found his technique underdeveloped. He stumbled over his words, not knowing where to begin. Guyun plucked the glass monocle from his face and turned to kiss Chang'e's cheek. If you don't like it, I won't wear it. At dawn, Chang'e woke to the imagined sound of Guyun's horrendous flute playing. He sat up dazedly and scrubbed at his eyes, feeling as if that terrible wail still echoed in his mind. He rubbed his sore ears, but couldn't help a smile from tugging up the corners of his lips. It was the best dream he'd ever had. Accompanied by Guyun's melody, dreadful enough to make demons and deities weep, Chang'e thought that even if he stood before the wicked god himself, he would have nothing to fear. Many kilometers away, as Guyun returned from patrol on the front lines the previous night, he had a mysterious itch between his shoulder blades, as if someone was watching him from behind. He had whipped his head around, inadvertently flinging the glass monocule off his face. The lens survived the fall, but the elaborate filigree frame had chipped when it collided with his armor. He had to admit, to his consternation, that while the trinket made a good accessory, it wasn't practical. He switched back to his usual one. When Shunyi heard the story the next morning, he had a good laugh at Guyun's expense. Maybe some deity got fed up with your airs. That deity needs to mind their own business, Chang'e said shamelessly. Maybe they saw how handsome I was and meant to offer themselves as a wife. The soldier stepped forward with a report before Shunyi could hawk up last night's dinner. Sir, the envoys you dispatched to Dongying have sent a reply. Let's have it, Guyun said. The far western army's supplies lines stretched across the ocean and through Dongying and depended on the nation's cooperation. They had been an accessory to this war from the very beginning, but had craftily avoided any open involvement. Even when Liao Shi had attempted to kidnap the long-gone emperor with the aid of several dozen Dongying warriors disguised as monks, he had acted out of a personal grudge, and his birth nation hadn't demanded justice on his behalf. What does it say? Shunyi asked. Guyun shook his head. They say the Dongying people were very polite, but hard to pin down. As soon as the envoys attempted any serious discussion, no one with authority would meet with them. They fobbed them off with some handsome young men and beautiful women dancing to entertain them. Dongying is running its own calculations here. If the far westerners put down roots in our soil, Dongying can look forward to a bellyful of carrion by simply trailing in their wake. But if the far western navy is defeated, they're still our neighbors across the EC. They'll contribute to the far western war effort, but they aren't willing to offend us outright. Shunyi frowned. What makes them think they can play both sides like this? Actually, they're doing us a favor, Guyun smiled. I'm relieved to see them so two-faced. Just wait. They'll be useful later on. We can't wait much longer, Shunyi shook his head. We're overextended in the south, and our violet gold stores are stretched thin. Even if you personally coordinate the allocation, we'll run out sooner or later. Not to mention, if the fighting doesn't let up, we're sure to hear voices of dissent from the court. A serious look returned to Guyun's face. The court thinks we should back down, Shunyi reminded him. They want to try diplomacy. You know they've been organizing some foreign affairs envoy. If these people are really coming to help reopen negotiations, great. But in the worst case, they're coming specifically to make trouble. Guyun thought to himself, when are they arriving? They should depart the capital any day now, Shunyi said. It won't take them more than half a month to get here. Zishi, what are your plans? Chapter 123. Dawn. After facing each other on the front lines for so long, fighting countless battles large and small, neither the far western nor Great Liang armies were willing to back down. The two opposing forces were roughly equal in strength, and neither could gain the upper hand. On the 16th day of the first month, availing themselves of the early light of dawn, a large fleet of Great Liang's sea dragon warships slipped out of port and glided soundlessly along the river, splitting Great Liang's already lean forces. The sun had yet to rise. Under cover of darkness, Shunyi turned to Guyuan. "Don't you think you're being too reckless?" Guyuan acted as if he hadn't heard. "Have someone make me a bowl of noodles come morning, with an egg," he added nonsensically. Shunyi's focus was split in so many directions he was on the verge of vertigo. Baffled, it took him half an age to remember what day it was. "Well, aren't you relaxed?" he muttered. He whispered some quiet instructions to a personal guard before picking up where he'd left off. "Didn't you say you'd wait till the railway tracks were laid? If we can manage to establish a dedicated transport corridor for Violet Gold, our chances of victory will be much higher. Make any move now, and the slightest miscoordination... it's too risky." "No risk, no reward," Guyun said, unfazed. "Look at me. I'm a man in my prime. Why should I be as cautious and timid as that old geezer across the river?" Seeing Guyun had lapsed back into aimless boasting, Shunyi snapped, "Gu Shi!" Guyun sighed, turning his eyes north. His eyes could no longer glimpse anything so distant. "Jiping," Guyun began, voice low. "This war would have been won ages ago if the court had been united. You tell me what carries the greater risk, forcing them to meet us now in battle or allowing our adversary to protract the war until turmoil upends our court." Shunyi stared, speechless. As a general tasked with protecting the nation's borders, he needed only to organize his troops and lay out his defense. It wasn't his job to consider the bigger picture, nor to worry about the possibility of Great Liang becoming embroiled in another military conflict 50 years down the line. "We must clinch this battle before the pacifists open their mouths. Otherwise, who knows how long those traitorous bastards will drag this out. The first beat of the war drum invigorates the soldiers' morale, the second weakens it, and the third drains it dry. Even if we step back to recover our strength, we can't afford to rest for more than a few years. Once the immediate wounds have healed, the noble sons of the northern capital will forget past pains, and when our generation passes on, our posterity will grow up believing the southern half of our nation has always been jointly governed." Guyun glanced at Shunyi. "The risk is worth it. When the time comes, I'll leave you the Black Iron Tiger Tally. If worst comes to worst, rally our remaining forces and wait it out. Keep your head and mobilize the Black Iron Battalion to serve as temporary reinforcements. The Westerners may be masters of naval warfare, but you've got nothing to fear from them on land. We'd still have options." Shunyi was sure to have wrinkles from frowning so much. Before he could say more, a mess officer arrived with a bowl of noodles, specially prepared for the marshal with utmost care. The longevity noodles were smooth and uniform in texture. The soup was hearty, the meat generous, the egg perfectly done. There were even a few thinly sliced bamboo shoots bobbing in the froth. Guyun accepted the bowl and shoveled 2 large bites into his mouth before pausing. "Why aren't there any greens?" Shunyi was mystified. "You don't eat greens." "Since when do I not eat greens?" Guyun grumbled. He gulped down a few more mouthfuls, but couldn't shake the feeling something was missing. After considering at length, he realized birthdays and holidays were entirely human inventions. Someone who willingly took the time to conduct such a simple ceremony on another's behalf was saying without words, "I care for you." The taste he craved derived not from ordinary ingredients, but from the feelings ladled into that simple bowl of broth. 5 days later, Guyun received a letter with the names of the envoys sent from the capital. He gave the list a cursory glance before handing it to Shunyi. "You see, we've no choice but to strike first." If those were the marshal's orders, it wasn't as if Shunyi could disobey. "Just in case, Jiping, there are some things I need to tell you. If it comes to it, you'll take charge in my stead. You have the strength to go toe-to-toe with the Westerners on land, but avoid the sea at all costs. You lack the naval battle experience to match that old bastard." As he spoke, Guyun retrieved 4 sealed letters from the commander's tent. "Send this first military dispatch to the capital if all goes according to plan. If instead the heavens turn their backs on us, send the second letter to the Grand Council. You'll have their complete cooperation and aid. Don't forget to append a memorial begging forgiveness and seal it with a black iron tiger tally. I'll take full responsibility. The last two are personal. Send the third to Chang'e to calm him down. Once things have settled, give him the fourth when you have the chance. What is this? Your last will and testament? Shunyi was furious. Do I need to give you my last will and testament when preparing to deal with a troop of far western monkeys? Guyuan arched a brow. This is called due diligence. And anyway, it saves me the trouble of having to write all these letters again. Orders are orders. Now stop running your mouth and get back to work. The next evening, Great Liang's navy launched a surprise attack, breaking through the Western forces' defense line with guns blazing. The two sides were by now familiar with each other's tactics, and the battle escalated the moment they clashed. Despite being caught off guard, the Western Navy quickly regrouped to mount a counter-offensive. They could sense from the outset that Great Liang's navy was fighting especially ferociously this time around. Mr. Jia had pulled a coat over his nightgown. Why would Guyuan break the stalemate on the front lines now? Nothing in their last intelligence had indicated such a move. Given what they knew about the current state of Great Liang's court, it was beyond the realm of reason. And yet Guyuan didn't even bother with routine reconnaissance this time, as if unconcerned with the depth of the enemy's violet gold reserves. He ordered his men to bring out the heavy artillery and launch cuttlefish at a pelting rain. Caught unawares, the Western flagship took several direct hits, and its freshly repaired side oars sank back underwater, paralyzed. Chaos descended. Do not panic! Mr. Jia grabbed a copper squall. Stand by our orders. Assemble all dragonettes. Intercept them. Your Holiness! The Pope strolled out onto the deck and surveyed the battlefield through a handheld field scope. Calm yourselves, he ordered, voice low. This venerated leader had the near-magical ability to pacify a soldier's frenzied heart. A few quietly spoken words, and the panic-stricken sailors around him promptly fell still, awaiting his command. The enemy's vanguard is half its usual size. It's unlike Guyuan to launch such a fierce attack at a numerical disadvantage, the Pope murmured. Why would he do this? Mr. Jia composed himself with some difficulty. The Great Liang folk have lost their minds. Perhaps we shouldn't see it as an attack, but as a bid for mutual destruction. The Pope shook his head, turning to give a messenger instructions about adjusting the corvette fleet's formation. That makes no sense. Mr. Jia frowned, mulling over his words. Long seconds later, he exclaimed, That's right! Your Holiness received communication from the enemy camp a few days ago that a diplomatic envoy was due to arrive on the front lines. Could this be related? The Pope tilted his head slightly. You mean to suggest a rift has formed within Great Liang's imperial court, and these envoys wish to negotiate terms to end the war? It's not unreasonable, Mr. Jia answered, gaining steam. Consider, Your Holiness, did we not estimate how long it would take Great Liang to complete their railway? At this time, Your Holiness said we would be at a disadvantage once they got it running. We drew up a number of plans to destroy their tracks, but based on our calculations, this railway line should have finished construction by the end of last year. In fact, we thought they'd have begun their trial runs by now, yet there's been no movement on that front at all. They must have encountered some internal difficulty. The Pope crossed an arm over his chest and stroked his chin. By now, Guyuan's vanguard had pierced the Western fleet's defensive perimeter like a blade, cresting the waves in a ferocious charge. The Western escort fleet encircled the commander's vessel in response, forming an impenetrable wall, while armored hawks launched from their flagship into the sky to rain attacks on their enemies from above. If it were me, Mr. Jia offered, unbidden, I would order our flagship to fall back and draw the enemy's vanguard in, then surround and annihilate them. They can't maintain such an intense barrage for long. We'll send them to a watery grave the moment they break off from the rest of their fleet. Do you really think Guyuan would commit such a rudimentary mistake? The Pope's voice was calm. Mr. Jia failed to respond. The most important thing on the battlefield is to know your enemy. Relay my orders. Gather in our flanks and focus on defense. Set a course due southeast and call for reinforcements, now. The Pope methodically issued orders as he carried on his conversation with Mr. Jia. If you analyze Gu's quelling of the rebellion in the East Sea and the capture of the mountain bandits in the Southwest, as well as the handful of times we fought against him in the North, you will gain a rough understanding of Guyuan's character. When at a true material disadvantage, he obscures the truth, even conjuring up the awe-inspiring Black Iron Battalion to frighten his adversaries. The Great Liang folk refer to this tactic as validating that which is false and falsifying that which is true. Mr. Jia found his explanation wanting, but he dared not protest. As you say, Your Holiness. Watch. This is just bait, the Pope said with a smile. We must be patient and draw the line out a little further. Soon we'll see what cards he holds. A messenger ran over with a report. Your Holiness, our 1st, 2nd, and 3rd squadrons have just left port on an open sea mission. What should we do? This open sea mission was serving as the armed escort for the cargo ships sailing to and from the Holy Empire with supplies. They won't have gotten far, the Pope said without looking back. Recall them. The open sea corridor is secure. There's no need to send 3 squadrons to escort such a small amount of cargo. We must treat our dear old foe with the respect he deserves. Yes, Your Holiness. The Pope's orders came one after another. Return to port. Gather in the left and right flanks. All corvettes, set course due southeast. Mind your speed. All hawks, fall back. Raise steel defense panels on the flagship. Activate the bilge pumps. The Western fleet drew back into a densely packed behemoth. The armed cargo escort that had just departed swiftly returned to harbor and turned predatory eyes on the intrepid Great Liang Navy cutting toward them through the water before forming an impenetrable defense. In the past, it had always been Guyuan leading the Westerners by the nose. Now the tables had turned, and the Westerners used their robust defense to hold Great Liang's vanguard at bay while searching for a vulnerable spot to bury their fangs. Half an hour later, Great Liang's rapid charge finally began to slow. Clearly, they were starting to tire. Ja, look, the Pope murmured. He had hardly finished speaking before a large fleet of Great Liang's reinforcements and supply ships swarmed toward them from the left, right, and center. The Great Liang troops had finally revealed their trump card, baring their vicious fangs in the dark of night. Mr. Jia was stunned. If they'd gone with his proposal and sent their flanks to surround Great Liang's vanguard, they would have lost 3 squadrons to the effort and overextended themselves, allowing the Great Liang ships lying in wait to tear effortlessly through their weakened defense. As I said, the Pope gave him a look of gentle reproach. Only by understanding your enemy will you find your true window of opportunity. All ships, prepare to fire. Strike them head-on before they can stabilize their formation. The Westerners' cannon fire swept outward like a tidal wave. Great Liang's main forces, split into 3, had barely stepped onto the field before suffering heavy casualties. The Sea Dragon warships leading the charge sinking one after another with no opportunity to return fire. With one attack, the Western cannons wiped out nearly a quarter of Great Liang's troops. The sailors of the Western fleet erupted in cheers. Since the day Guyuan took control of the Liangjiang theater, they had never once gained such a commanding upper hand. Across the water, Guyuan wasn't at all the sorry sight they imagined. He stood aboard an unremarkable mid-sized sea dragon in the center of the Great Liang fleet, watching as a large swath of his warships foundered under enemy fire. He didn't even blink as he said to the personal guard beside him, "See, what did I tell you? Know thyself, know thine enemy." That old bastard could spend decades preparing for a single battle. He must have studied me carefully. Had it not been the dead of night, the Westerners would have rapidly discovered that all those sunken ships were empty shells, much like the cuttlefish submersibles. This rotten idea had been cooked up by the impoverished mechanics of the Lingshu Institute. In a fit of inspiration, they'd gathered up the frontline warships that had been relegated to scrap, stripped them down to their hulls, and refitted them with a replica of the cuttlefish sub's propulsion system. Gutting the interior left the vessels extremely light, allowing them to travel great distances unmanned with only a little thrust. They weren't terribly useful as ships, but they were perfect as a bluff to frighten their enemies. The Westerners would have surely grown suspicious if Guyuan had mobilized a portion of his naval forces and made a show of stepping onto the battlefield himself. Thus, he used this tactic to deceive the enemy. "It's to our own advantage if they get carried away by their momentary success," Guyuan said, crossing one leg over the other. "Spread out, and mark this. Our mission today is to stall the enemy as long as necessary." The guard licked his lips nervously. "Sir, will our comrades make it in time?" "Only heaven knows. If they don't, then it seems fate has finally abandoned me." Guyuan chuckled softly. "Remember, be flexible." On the Western flagship, Mr. Jia had indeed allowed his joy over their victory to swell his head, although, with His Holiness at his side, he dared not get too carried away. He soon discovered that, despite this setback, the enemy navy was far more tenacious than expected. After their initial stumble, Great Liang quickly changed tact, hounding the Westerners with Guyuan's infuriating battle tactics. What should have been a one-sided drubbing soon became an even match. The clash between the two forces dragged on till morning. The first sliver of sunlight split the sea, laying bare the scattered battle formations that had survived the long night. On Great Liang's flagship, a guard was saying anxiously, "Sir, we've yet to receive word from the other squad. I recommend we withdraw for now. Our position will be exposed if we continue to fight. We don't have an impregnable iron monster like them. You mustn't endanger yourself." Guyuan ran a finger over the frame of his glass monocle. "Patience." On the Western sea monster, the Pope shoved his field scope into Mr. Jia's hands. That enemy ship, that's their flagship. Guyuan must be aboard. Capture it at once." Concentrated artillery fire shifted at the Pope's command, cornering Guyuan's flagship in an instant. "Marshal!" the guard cried. A handful of corvettes acted without orders and rushed out to shield the flagship from the incoming fusillade as a deafening explosion rocked the flagship. Guyuan's face froze as another sailor stumbled in. "Sir, we can't hold them any longer." Guyuan narrowed his eyes. "Steady now. Shift the rear guard to the van. Let's take our enemies for a walk," Guyuan muttered. "Starting with—" His orders were drowned by the shriek of a hawk so shrill it pierced even Guyuan's half-deaf ears. He whipped his head around. This was the signal he and Shun Yi had agreed upon. The ground squad had succeeded. The guard leapt to his feet. "That's our hawk!" "Hand me my field scope," Guyuan ordered. The guard licked cracked lips. "Sir, we—" "Look out!" Boom! An enemy cannonball slipped through a gap between corvettes and struck the Great Liang flagship's stern. The Sea Dragon rocked and shuddered, pouring smoke and sparks. Amid the clamor, a glass monocle arced through the air and hit the deck, splintering into dust. On the 24th day of the first month, before the Foreign Affairs mission had set so much as a foot in Jiangnan, Li Feng was rudely awakened by an emergency military dispatch from the front lines. The letter was sealed with the black iron tiger tally. There had been a great victory in Liangjiang. The plan Guyuan had meticulously laid out over the past half-year had finally borne fruit. No one knew when he had sent agents south to investigate rebellion among the Western-occupied islands of the South Sea, or when he had dispatched a large force to lie in ambush along the southwestern border. On the 21st day of the first month, Great Liang's navy mobilized a portion of its main force to mount a surprise attack on the Western Navy, exploiting their commander's cautious nature to pin the enemy troops in their harbor. Simultaneously, the Great Liang Sea Dragon warships lurking along the southern border swept through the South Sea Islands and, in coordination with Guyuan's agents and the revolting populace, wiped out the occupying Western forces. They immediately sent troops to cut off their enemy's supply route through the South Sea and throttle their adversaries' necks before they could react. Who said Great Liang's navy was incapable of waging war on the high seas? The report was concise, proclaiming the victory without going into any detail about the battle or its casualties. The battered Western fleet retreated to the Dongying archipelago, and revolts erupted across the entire south half of the nation as local militia seized their chance to overthrow the occupying enemy troops. It was the first glimmer of dawn on the long-dormant front lines. Leaping out of bed, Li Feng threw on his clothes, ready to call a grand assembly right there in the middle of the night. Forget that shitty foreign affairs mission. They wouldn't allow the Westerners to take so much as a clump of soil if they could beat them back to where they came from. Palace attendants buzzed around him in a panicked flurry. Li Feng had gone through a number of attendants since Zhu Xiaojiao's death, but none had been to his liking. The attendant currently serving him was a reticent old man who had his moments of quick-wittedness. "Congratulations, Your Majesty! With Marshal Gu on the front lines, we're sure to see the recovery of Jiangnan." Li Feng laughed brightly, nearly incoherent with excitement. "At this rate, we'll no longer have to worry about explaining ourselves to our ancestors beneath the 9 springs." The emperor, who had been limping around since his injury months ago, sprinted from his bedchamber as if carried by the wind. Yet halfway to his destination, an early morning breeze trickled past, cooling the long-gone emperor's fevered brain. The joy coloring his face faded. This was indeed a stunning victory. But what came next? A number of policies had been implemented by the Grand Council for the ostensible purpose of prioritizing the war effort above all. Meanwhile, aside from brandishing their iron certificates and weaponizing their seniority before Li Feng, the representatives from the major noble families had never let off trying to negotiate an armistice. Li Feng himself had wavered between continuing to fight and suing for peace. But now, Guyuan's victory tipped the proverbial scale in Li Feng's mind heavily to one side. The noble families have grown bold. They even dare interfere in matters of war. The emperor mused in silence. What are their intentions? Li Feng's footsteps came to a halt. He turned to his attendant and said out of the blue, "It's been many years since our nurse, Lady Zhao, last entered the imperial palace. Do you still remember her?" Flummoxed, the palace attendant lowered his head with an affirmative hum. "I've heard Madame Zhao has only one child, a daughter, who works in the palace. She's taken the 3rd young master of the Fang family as her godson. She submitted a number of requests to enter the palace a while back, presumably to plead on his behalf." Li Feng hummed thoughtfully and narrowed his eyes. "When a prince breaks the law, he is punished, just like a commoner. I don't recall anyone stepping forward to beg for mercy back when Prince Wei was relegated to the imperial dungeons. Yet each of these noble sons is so precious." Sensing his dangerous mood, the palace attendant glanced cautiously at Li Feng and dared not say another word. The sharp wind had cooled the hot sweat on Li Feng's brow. He pressed a hand to his chest and coughed quietly. The palace attendant hastily draped a fox fur cloak over his shoulders. The crown prince was old enough to exhibit the first signs of his future character. He was clever, but gentle in temperament, nothing like the fiery Li Feng. He resembled rather the late Yuanhe emperor. But what had been the state of the nation during the Yuanhe emperor's reign? Li Feng vividly remembered his father's insecurities. He had always felt his throne illegitimately inherited and struck bargains with all manner of individuals, asking this or that person for advice over the most trivial matters. Though all that remained of the Gu family was a half-grown child, he had failed to seize control of Great Liang's military power and left that infernal black iron tiger tally in the hands of an outsider. He was frequently overcome by sentiment and had raised a swarm of termites that had eaten through the largest part of the substantial wealth passed down by Emperor Wu. After a decade of effort, Li Feng still had yet to mop up the mess left behind by the late emperor. But in recent years, he had increasingly felt the gap between his strength and his ambition. He did not wish to leave his son in a similar predicament. Yet, given the present circumstances, whom could he trust? Prince Yan? It had been Prince Yan himself who stated that he had no desire for marriage or children, and that his only wish was to follow the ways of the Lord of Shang and sacrifice his all for the good of Great Liang. If Prince Yan had meant to flatter him, there were plenty of other blandishments more pleasing to imperial ears. Only look at the shameless officials who shed bitter tears over their devotion to the nation despite conclusive evidence of their treachery. Li Feng had indeed been momentarily moved by Prince Yan's words, but time had returned him to his senses. Li Feng protected Chang'an because he saw the value in his reforms. Prince Yan was right about one thing. Laws and institutions took priority over all else. No matter what it was Prince Yan truly sought with his reforms, it was a fact that this badly battered nation was changing for the better. If Li Feng could leverage Prince Yan to cure the country of the deep-rooted rot of the previous reign, he might yet pass down a well-ordered nation to his young crown prince. At the same time, he couldn't possibly leave his lamb-like son in the care of his ruthless younger brother. Before it came time for him to follow in the late emperor's footsteps, the first two subjects he would do away with would be Prince Yan and Gu Yun. Forget it. Back to the palace. We'll call for a grand assembly come morning. At dawn, summon the crown prince, Li Feng instructed to the great confusion of his attendant. Moments ago, the emperor had been going on about Madame Zhao. Yet now, after a few beats of silence, he suddenly brought up the crown prince. Also, Li Feng continued, where is the memorial? Bring it here. We want to take a look. This was a memorial written by Xu Ling on the reformation of the Imperial Academy's bylaws. The ideas were underdeveloped, even immature, but no matter. It could be tossed to the Grand Council to be refined. The imperial court was baying for blood, eager to see those who had cheated on the imperial examinations executed for their crimes. Only a handful of scholars still had the presence of mind to consider the future. Li Feng was like any father. If possible, he wished to provide his young son a few more years of protection, a little longer spent playing with grass-woven insects in the inner palace. Yet, who but heaven knew what this turbulent age had in store? The next morning, news of the great victory on the Liangzhang battlefront struck the court like a slap in the face. The various forces of the capital were given no time to react as, in an unprecedented move, Li Feng made his position clear by proclaiming two new policies at the Grand Assembly that very day. First, he allowed the Grand Council to abolish the war beacon tickets and revise national monetary policy. This would become known to future generations as the New Longan Decree. Second, he declared that he agreed in principle with the memorial Xu Ling had submitted on behalf of the Department of Supervision and the Imperial Censorate to reform the Imperial Academy. As for any flaws in the proposal, he ordered the Grand Council to take the lead in collaborating with the Ministry of Rights, the Imperial Academy, and the two regulatory departments to revise the document. At the same time, Li Feng openly took Jiang Chong and the Lingshu Institute to task in the main hall. He ordered the former to expedite the investigation into the imperial examination fraud case that spanned 9 provinces. All those implicated were to suffer severe punishment, irrespective of family background. He then instructed the Lingshu Institute to draw up whatever plans they needed to bring the steam locomotive into operation. They couldn't afford to waste this victory and allow the Westerners time to catch their breaths. If the war was to be won, it must be now, in one fell swoop. As the Grand Assembly drew to a close, Li Feng made a final pronouncement. The 11-year-old crown prince was to begin listening in on business in court. Chapter 124. Endgame, Part 1. The cryptic Longan Emperor had never so clearly expressed his stance. He hadn't revealed so much as a word of his thoughts to anyone in advance. It wasn't only Fang Qin's faction. Even the Grand Council was flabbergasted. Jiang Chong shot Prince Yan a surreptitious glance. Did His Majesty take the wrong medicine today? Unfazed, Chang'an offered a few bland words of flattery. Despite his engagement in politics, he had a distant, ethereal aura, as if removed from the mundane concerns of human society. He was unflappable even when doling out adulation, which only strengthened the impression that he was in cahoots with Li Feng. Certain individuals' expressions shifted as they watched. Li Feng was well aware that Prince Yan had been leaning on imperial authority. All the civil and military officials of the court had their own agendas. It didn't matter. He could help Prince Yan out of his predicament as easily as he could lend his assistance to anyone else. This time, Li Feng had used 2 imperial decrees to push the Grand Council into the eye of the storm. He wanted to see how those iron certificate brandishing nobles so favored by the Yuanhe Emperor handled this upstart prince, who had come into his role already half grown and only addressed the late emperor as father once in his life. It was sure to be another sleepless night in the capital. In the office of the Grand Council, Jiang Chong spoke quietly to Chang'eng. "Your Highness, what should we do? Do we proceed with our original plan?" Chang'eng replied with no hesitation. "We strike while the iron is hot." Jiang Chong shot Chang'eng a glance before continuing. "Your Highness, what if we push too hard and they do something drastic?" Chang'eng turned to look at him, voice heavy with implication. "What I truly fear is that they won't. Han Shishong, do you know the most useful piece of advice I've ever received?" Jiang Chong felt an inexplicable frisson of apprehension. "On the battlefield, whoever clings to his life is the first to die." By chance, on his way home from the office of the Grand Council, Chang'eng's carriage encountered Fang Qin's in a narrow lane. He motioned to Huodan. "Let Minister Fang go first." Huodan assented, only to hurry back a moment later. "Your Highness, Minister Fang says that he wouldn't dare act so discourteously. He has already cleared the way." Chang'eng lifted the window screen of his carriage and politely cupped his hands toward Fang Qin. The two brushed past each other with utmost cordiality, not at all like the irreconcilable adversaries they were. Chang'eng leaned against the wall of his carriage. If he were in Fang Qin's place, he thought, he would lie low and wait for these latest developments to blow over. Then, after the young upstarts of the imperial court had seized control of transportation and public finance, but while their positions were yet unstable from their rapid ascent, he would give the situation a final push and silently wait for Li Feng to take action. The imperial court was shrouded in a complex web of aristocratic connections, with influence and intrigue lurking in every corner. So long as those who sought to restore the old system had the patience to wait out the war and laid their plans carefully, there would be another opportunity. Chang'eng had a good grasp on Fang Qin's steady nature. He was certain that this was his thinking as well. Even if Chang'eng had to drag everyone behind him as he walked this tightrope, he would do it if it meant denying Fang Qin peace of mind as he waited for his moment to arrive. Fang Qin watched Prince Yan's carriage dwindle into the distance before instructing his coachmen to be on their way. Wrapped in the purple of twilight as dusk slipped into deep night, he seemed to see the current of time rushing past in a tumultuous stream, like blood through an artery. He was helpless to stop it. The embankment on which he planted his feet was built up of sand and gravel. It seemed formidable, but was seconds from falling away. The odds were stacked against him. When he returned to the Fang estate, he was greeted as usual by the sight of guests waiting to speak with him. Grand Secretary Fang had set aside his pursuit of Taoist transcendence and was personally receiving callers in the front hall. The moment Fang Qin entered, everyone stood and looked at him as one, all with different emotions in their eyes. Fang Qin felt a prickle of unease. "Father, what's going on?" Grand Secretary Fang's expression was grim as an overcast sky. "Your godsister was accused of an affront against Her Majesty the Empress today. She's been placed under house arrest. Not even her family may see her." Old Madame Fang was a bosom friend of that Lady Zhao who was the emperor's old wet nurse, and had jokingly named her the godmother of Fang Qin's young brother, the third young master Fang. This was a matter that had nothing to do with Fang Qin, but out of a sense of friendly politeness, he referred to Lady Zhao's daughter, who was in service in the imperial palace, as his godsister in public. Fang Qin was shocked. "Why?" "Why?" the Grand Secretary Fang repeated slowly. "Remember, His Majesty called Guyun his imperial uncle and treated him as family since childhood. Yet one whiff of discord was all it took for him to throw the man in the dungeon. If the Marquis of Order is treated thus, what more need be said of people like us? His Majesty's ruthlessness truly chills the heart." Mind racing, Fang Qin turned toward an old servant. "Send a message to Duke Zhao. Tell him to cease these petty tricks and rotten ideas. He must quit while he's ahead." The room exploded in a storm of protest. One of the guests stepped forward to object. "Minister Fang, Why do you once again side with outsiders? Fang Qin ignored him, fixing his gaze on Grand Secretary Fang. Father, don't you see? His Majesty isn't the late Emperor. He won't tolerate even a hint of dissent. Try to force his hand, and you'll suffer his fury. Our goal is to root out Prince Yan's faction, is it not? What good is challenging His Majesty? He pressed on before Grand Secretary Fang could cut in, his tone as severe as the lines of his face. I want to protect my brother as well, but if we continue down this road, he won't be the only casualty. Everyone here is of one mind, so I'll be frank. Do you think Duke Zhao's wiped his own ass clean? If Prince Yan gets his hands on incriminating evidence and raises a fuss, it'll become that much more difficult for us to fight back. It's one railway line. Aside from making Li Min gnash his teeth, what tangible good do we do by blocking its construction? Guyuan can dispatch troops with the snap of his fingers long before your would-be foreign affairs envoy can reach the front lines. What more can you do? Cut off supplies to our own soldiers and betray our nation? He had been stewing in discontent for too long. When he finally lashed out, he didn't even spare his father's dignity. There was a heavy beat of silence before someone finally responded. Then, does Minister Fang really intend to take this lying down? Fang Qin was at a loss. He suddenly realized he would never get through to these people, especially now that Grand Secretary Fang had emerged from retirement to take the lead. Sometimes it wasn't violent winds and torrential rains that sank a ship. Sometimes the vessel simply reached the end of its natural lifespan. Fang Qin glanced around the room with a final cold sneer and stalked away. Sitting perfectly upright, Grand Secretary Fang lowered his eyes and stroked a hand over his beard. My son lacks manners. My apologies, gentlemen. An elderly minister, so wizened he could barely crack open his rheumy eyes, spoke up from beside him. The second young master may be a brilliant talent, but he is still brash with youth. Fang Qin could hardly be considered a youth at his age, but Grand Secretary Fang only shook his head ponderously. It's as you say. During the reign of Emperor Wu, he was still young. He didn't experience those turbulent years as we did. I've always been of mind that some things are better kept from the younger generation, if only to spare them the agony of indecision. We who aided the late emperor's ascension yet remain. If we gather our descendants, we may yet have the strength to accomplish our objective. Still, that unfilial son of mine was right about one thing. Tell Duke Zhao to curb his petty tricks. Why expend so much effort for such meager results? Enough with this farce. Prince Yan, however, allowed Duke Zhao no such opportunity. The next day, the Lingshu Institute submitted a memorial announcing that, after rigorous testing, the steam locomotive was ready for operation. They invited the long-gone emperor to inspect the invention with his own two eyes. Li Fang happily brought the crown prince down to the testing grounds and even climbed aboard and rode the steam locomotive for a stretch of track. After returning to the palace, and before the novelty had quite faded, he received a memorial from Yao Zhen in Jiangbei asking when the railway would be operational. This only aggravated the long-gone emperor's existing anxieties. Come evening, the censorate delivered the final match that lit his imperial temper aflame by submitting a memorial accusing Duke Zhao of mismanagement, illegal seizure of property, and various other misconduct. The Canal Commission and the Lingshu Institute, jointly responsible for the steam railway line, promptly added their voices to the stream of excoriations. With so many people adding fuel to the fire, the eruption that followed was inevitable. Amid the chaos, the influence Prince Yan had accumulated over the past several years finally began to make itself felt. He had pried open the pathway to upward mobility that had been clogged since the final years of Emperor Wu's reign. Immediately thereafter, as if on cue, more reports of illegal land occupation in various regions began to crop up one after another, finally dragging this issue that had long plagued the nation out into the spotlight. More onlookers, eager to fan the flames, stepped forward and requested a full national investigation. Li Fang rejected such an absurd proposal out of hand. Even if he wanted to intimidate the noble families, their dismantlement would have to be carried out step by step over time. He was loath to bite off more than he could chew. Unfortunately, Duke Zhao, that imbecile who had stuck his neck out first, was out of luck. He was arrested within a matter of days and went on to implicate a slew of sycophants who relished abusing their power. Bystanders practically scaled the walls to watch as these miscreants were escorted away in chains, their properties confiscated. Within days, the storytellers of Southward Tower had compiled a collection of new tales that became wildly popular with the public. The Crown Prince, who had just begun listening in on court assemblies, found himself with a front row seat to this explosive case. It was quite the learning experience for the lad, who watched the drama unfold in dumbstruck silence. Prince Yan had refrained from expressing his stance throughout most of the proceedings, but as a particular court session drew to a close, he turned to the young prince. "What do you think, Your Highness?" he asked kindly. Raised under the shelter of Li Feng's protection, the little crown prince had grown up innocent and artless. Li Feng had once ordered him to seek his fourth imperial uncle's guidance, so when Chang'e asked, the boy regurgitated his young uncle's teachings without thinking. The philosopher Han Fei once said, "If a monarch is ignorant of politics, he will be played for a fool. If a subject is unrestrained by law, he will sow chaos." The stability of the nation depends on its law. Just as people may be witless or wise, traitorous or true, when it comes to the larger matters of the world, there is right and there is wrong. If the law lacks clarity, crooked individuals and warring factions will overrun the nation, in which case, wouldn't those in power have a hard time dealing with it all? His voice had yet to shed the pure tones of childhood. He was like a schoolboy who had been tapped by his teacher to answer a question before the class. Upon finishing his recitation, he looked up hopefully. Chang'e offered him a wordless smile, but Li Feng rebuked him with a scowl. "What are you doing, parroting the lines of your school books? Get back to your studies. You must apply yourself." The crown prince didn't dare talk back to his father. Head drooping, he murmured his assent. But though he'd merely blurted those childish words, his artless speech sounded heavy with meaning to suspicious ears. Those who judged others by their own measure might regard even a half-grown child to be as shrewd and cunning as themselves, finding hidden knives in every word. That evening, the 11-year-old crown prince's speech spread from the palace like wildfire. Unbeknownst to Fang Qin, Grand Secretary Fang gathered up all the ravenous old wolves who had once hoisted the late emperor onto the throne. Together, they pored over every speck of spittle uttered by the crown prince, trying to divine Li Feng's meaning. "It's been 3 generations, Grand Secretary Fang said with an ugly sneer. "We are beyond the help of heaven's favor. I'm sure you've all puzzled it out as well. It was His Majesty who ordered the Crown Prince to sit in on court sessions. And there you have it. He's determined to see us old geezers dead. If not for Imperial Uncle Wang's interference at that banquet, our plan might have succeeded. Prince Yan would have been stripped of his title and exiled to some backwater from muddying the imperial bloodline," someone else added. "To think a bastard child who crawled out of some hole in the ground dares to walk all over us like this. Feng Xiong, decisiveness is what's called for now. Wavering will lead us to disaster." Grand Secretary Fang's wrinkles deepened as he surveyed the room. "My friends, if you would all write down your recommendation on your hands." Decades ago, a group of ambitious conspirators had gathered to reveal the Yuanhe Emperor's name written on each of their palms. Now, though some of their number were dead and buried and others were near to it, these men once again circled round and bared to each other their wizened palms. "Vacate the throne. Vacate the throne. Rid the emperor of treacherous ministers and vacate the throne. The eldest imperial prince has no mother." "During the reign of Emperor Wu," Grand Secretary Fang said, "when Prince Xiao feigned illness while on the road, it was I who learned of his intention to secretly enter the capital. I asked the eldest princess to deploy the northern camp to intercept and arrest him for conspiracy against the state. From there, we pushed the late emperor onto the throne, and history, as they say, is written by the victors." His voice was barely audible. "Today, you've all seen how things stand in the capital. As for how to gain the upper hand and who can be trusted, I'm sure many of you had a plan in mind prior to this meeting." Grand Secretary Fang wasn't the type to act rashly. He knew they wouldn't have the Gu family on their side this time. The northern camp was out of their grasp. As for the Imperial Guard, ever since Liu Chongshan's rebellion, the force had undergone major reorganization. Any officers with more than 100 soldiers under their command were subject to a thorough investigation to verify that they had a clean background and that the military achievements were genuine. The new policies closed several loopholes and split the Imperial Guard into two divisions with supervisory privileges over each other. This both allowed them to check each other's power without interfering in the other's work and act as a safeguard against any one person co-opting the whole organization and moving against the emperor. But all things had their advantages and disadvantages. Great Liang's social upper crust was divided between scholarly and military families, and many military officers held inherited titles of nobility. Most of these families had suffered a steady decline, which was why the Yuanhe emperor had been forced to appoint a stripling youth to lead troops into battle during the Western campaign. If the descendants of these famed generals living off of faded glory of their ancestors found themselves with no literary or martial achievements of their own, they would do as Liu Chongshan had. Use their family's influence to enter the Imperial Guard, spend a few years climbing the ranks and scraping together something approximating meritorious service, then quickly move up in the world. After so many years, these young master soldiers and the genuine battle-tested troops had cultivated a unique form of coexistence. Both paid each other due respect, and together they sustained a certain level of combat readiness within the Imperial Guard while maintaining a degree of peace. Unfortunately, in the aftermath of the Imperial Guard's rebellion, Li Feng had upset this balance. Perhaps the emperor had fancied himself clear-headed when he issued the order. Either way, no one stepped in to remind the furious Li Feng that in following through with these reforms, he was destroying the prospects of the capital city's young master. All these noble sons had grown up in the lap of luxury. How could they resign themselves to being lowly foot soldiers for the rest of their lives? The emperor had nothing to fear from offending these young masters, but there was another military force at play in the capital. In the early years of the Great Liang dynasty, when literary arts were neglected in favor of martial prowess, their ancestors had passed down a special privilege. Those who had been conferred titles of nobility on the basis of military achievements were permitted to retain private armed forces as part of their estate's guard. These troops protected their descendants and served as the nation's final line of defense in times of crisis. In fact, back when Liu Chongshan and Liu Chang's faction revolted, Fang Qin had used these very forces to stall the rebels until the northern camp's arrival. Grand Secretary Fang looked around the room. When Gu Yuan reignited the conflict in the East Sea, he also sent reinforcements to the southwest. He only has so many people at his disposal, and as it stands, all have been dispatched to defend our borders. Meanwhile, the northern camp cannot enter the capital without an imperial decree. Li Min cares solely for his own fame and reputation. He's a pretentious man who shuns the company of others. Everywhere he goes, he's accompanied by only a handful of old geezers. I've heard he's decent on a horse and can shoot a bow, but really, what's he done besides show off some flashy tricks from atop a watchtower? I doubt he's capable of more than that. We can eliminate him without much effort. The only question that remains is, shall we take care of him in the shadows or in the light? If I may ask, what constitutes shadow and light? Someone spoke up from behind him. The Grand Secretary, who had mentored half the imperial court, responded with no change in expression. To carry out our plan in the shadows, we would need a few dozen suicide fighters to ambush Li Min on his way home in the evening after the Grand Assembly. Then we bury the evidence and wait for things to blow over. His Majesty will have no choice but to let the matter go. To carry out our plan in the light, we would have to remind His Majesty whom his most faithful and loyal subjects are, show him how they have been protecting his nation all this time, and take it upon ourselves to arrest the treacherous ministers of his court. At that point, the inheritor of the throne would be ours to decide. That, Master Fang, I fear it won't be easy to carry out our plan in the light. The speaker was the son of the Marquis of Pingning, who had been one of the 3 marquises in the capital. His father had passed away years ago. His son had a generous paunch and found it laborious to walk, so he rarely left the house. Though he looked nothing like the issue of a renowned general, he was an unusually clear-headed individual. Setting aside the difficulty of avoiding the Imperial Guard and palace sentries, even if we succeed, His Majesty's the type who finds death preferable to dishonor. He'll insist on getting to the bottom of things. The more intractable characters of the northern camp are all dead. Their troops won't enter the capital without an imperial decree. But what if His Majesty sends for them in his fury? And we can't discount the sentries within the palace and the Imperial Guard without it. Liu Chongshan and Liu Chang's rebellion raised waves that have yet to subside. I'm afraid we have an uphill battle ahead of us. The sentries can't cover every centimeter of the palace guards. Similarly, there are places the Imperial Guard cannot enter, Grand Secretary Fang said dismissively. I've heard that in light of the victory in Liangjiang, the bootlickers in the Department of Rights have submitted a memorial requesting His Majesty offer sacrifices to heaven and earth. They intend to make a great show of praying for the fate of the nation to boost morale. There will be plenty of opportunity for us there. As for how to deal with His Majesty's anger, he chuckled and lifted slender, drooping eyes. We'll simply ensure that he has no opportunity to get angry in the first place. Don't tell me you really believe that with Li Min out of the way, His Majesty will let us off the hook? We all heard what the Crown Prince said in court today. He's but a child. What does he know of this nation's affairs? Who do you think taught him those words? He's 11 years old, yet he's preaching about the unbending nature of law and the importance of stamping out factions, pointing at the mulberry tree while cursing the locust tree. Who can't see what he really means? He came just short of calling us out by name and labeling us enemies of the state. My friends, do you intend to equivocate until the Crown Prince ascends the throne and gives us all a length of white silk with which to hang ourselves? Grand Secretary Fang had done away with all subtlety. His words were shocking. As expected of an old minister personally named Zhuang Yuan by the late emperor, Grand Secretary Fang was bold as brass. He had seemed innocuous enough when silent, but the moment he stepped back onto the political stage, he was sure to move mountains. His message was blunt. If the emperor turns his back on us, we'll do away with the emperor, and if the young crown prince won't heed his puppet masters, we'll swap him out for his motherless elder brother. Marquis Pingning stared in stupefaction for a long moment before stuttering out another critical issue. But even then, there's no way Gu Yun will let the matter go. The Foreign Affairs mission has yet to reach the front lines, but everything should be in order. Grand Secretary Fang chuckled softly. The perilous front lines, the rapacious foreigners who eye our borders, an envoy from the capital. Come now, the cast has been assembled and the time is ripe. Don't tell me you've forgotten what happened 20 years ago. A tempest was brewing over the heart of the nation, yet Prince Yan, standing in the eye of the storm, seemed oblivious. He attended court as usual and pressed ahead with his new policies. On this particular day, he was in exceptionally high spirits, having just received a letter from Gu Yun. Gu Yun had sent this missive directly to the Marquis estate, a personal letter through and through. When Captain Hua handed it over, he couldn't help but blush at the way Changgang's eyes lit up. Has he sprouted 3 heads and 6 arms or something? What could there possibly be to write about now? Changgang held the envelope to the light, trying to peek into its contents, as he grumbled half-heartedly at Huodan. I'm shocked he has the leisure to send me letters when he's so busy fighting the Westerners. Honestly, what am I to do with that man? The Marquis estate had never had a mistress of the house in the traditional sense. Uncle Hua, ever the steadfast personal guard, had of course noticed hints here and there, but still, it was difficult for him to adjust to these new norms, much less discuss his marshal's personal letters with his other master, who held such a unique status. As he listened to Prince Yan, he felt as though he had transformed from the captain of the estate guard into a gossipy old woman. He stood there in embarrassment like a blushing doorpost. It was the first time Gu Yun had sent Chang'eng such a thick letter since the fight resumed, and Chang'eng didn't have quite the heart to open it just yet. He ran his fingers over the envelope again and again, and even leaned in to sniff the paper with an infatuated expression, as if he picked up a hint of his far-away lover's scent. Huodan's cheeks were so red that blood was about to seep from his pores. "Your Highness, what are you doing?" he stuttered. Chang'eng glanced at him. Amused by Huodan's scarlet cheeks, he couldn't help but tease the man. "You know, I dreamed of my Yifu last night. I woke up in the middle of the night and couldn't fall back asleep. I truly learned what it means to toss and turn all night, only to receive this letter today. Isn't it a remarkable coincidence?" At the words, "my Yifu," Huodan shuddered and pressed his lips shut. "What on earth is the little Marquis doing?" he lamented to himself. "This is getting out of hand. The old Marquis and eldest princess will be rolling in their graves." Hiding a smile, Chang'eng slid a slim knife through the paper to open the envelope when a Linyuan wooden bird burst through the window. The sudden defection of Liu Zhong, Chang'eng had thought, was rather too good to be true. He had sent 2 Linyuan pavilion members south to Liangjiang to investigate, one openly and one in secret. The former had disguised himself as a servant of the Liu family and joined the Foreign Affairs mission, serving as a point of contact between Liu Zhong and the capital. The latter was a martial arts expert. He followed the Foreign Affairs mission in the shadows and reported any unusual behavior straight to Chang'eng. Chang'eng hastily tucked Gu Yuan's personal letter into his lapels and opened the wooden bird. As his eyes flicked over the contents, he sneered. Some people really did think of everything. Chapter 125, Endgame, Part 2. Far away in Jiangbei, a personal guard caught the wooden bird before it could flap its way into the commander's tent. He fiddled with it, turning it over and over in his hands to no avail. Just as he braced himself to go ask the camp's resident Lingshu scholar, a low voice stopped him. "I'll take that." The guard looked up to see Shen Yi approaching and hastily presented the little bird with both hands. Taking it from him, Shen Yi stroked his fingers over its wooden head. The guard blinked in surprise. Did General Shen just sigh? This wooden bird had been attracted by the magnet General Zhongchan had left behind. Shen Yi padded into the dimly lit commander's tent with the bird in hand. Army medics filed in and out without a word, and a pungent medicinal stench mixed with the lingering copper of blood assaulted his nose. Yao Zhen turned toward Shen Yi with a grave expression. During the naval battle a few days ago, while stalling for time, Gu Yuan's flagship had been struck by enemy fire. The vessel had disintegrated on the spot as its gold tanks exploded in a brilliant display of pyrotechnics. Even without use of his sight and hearing, Gu Yuan had reacted quickly. The instant he felt the impact, he ordered his men to abandon ship and dive into the water. It was thanks to this that he hadn't been a burnt corpse when the armored hawks fished him from the river. The Far Westerners' ocean-going supply line was broken, and Gu Yuan had dispatched troops to seize control of the upper reaches of the Nei River before the recent naval battle. With both supply routes severed, the enemy had no choice but to retreat into Dongying waters. If not for the severity of their commander-in-chief's injuries, this battle would have gone down in history as a flawless victory. This time, Gu Yuan had prepared all the battle reports and personal letters in advance. His precarious state was thus concealed from outsiders and insiders alike. Even within the Liangjiang garrison, few knew the extent of his wounds. Aside from a handful of senior officers, personal guards, field doctors, and the armored hawks that had dragged him from the water, the news had been effectively suppressed. One could imagine the amount of pressure Shen Yi and Yao Zhen found themselves under. "How is he?" Shen Yi asked. "You came at the right time. He's awake," Yao Zhen said, his voice low. "Thank goodness Marshal Gu had the foresight to bring you here, Jiping Xiong. Otherwise, it really would have been like the sky had fallen." Shen Yi grimaced. "Hardly. You'll grow accustomed to this stuff soon enough. Go get some rest. I need to speak to him." Yao Zhen nodded and dismissed the field doctors from the tent before stepping out himself. Shen Yi tiptoed over and picked up Gu Yuan's hand, dangling limply over the side of the bed. The bed's hanging screen had been lowered as people bustled in and out of the commander's tent, but Gu Yuan was ignorant to it all. Only when he felt Windslasher calloused fingers against his palm did he realize his visitor was Shun Yi. Guyuan was a mess of wounds, with hardly an intact patch of skin on him. Steel panels fixed his entire body in place so that he couldn't even turn his head. He had managed to drift into a deep sleep only to wake up again from the pain, and the moment he opened his eyes, his forehead was drenched in cold sweat. But whether his eyes were open or closed, there was no focus in them. The field doctors had explained that explosions could easily damage one's eyes and ears, and, to make matters worse, Guyuan had been subjected to multiple blasts. It was the best he could do to perceive light and shadow. Never mind his glass monocle. Even if he strapped a field scope to his face, it would have been no use. No one could say whether his vision would recover. Will I really be blind forever? Guyuan wondered in silence. Shunyi's eyes stung when he saw Guyuan's vacant gaze. There's a letter from the Lingyuan Pavilion, he wrote into Guyuan's palm. Guyuan blinked once. Shunyi opened the wooden bird again to convey its contents to Guyuan, but as he swept his eyes over the letter inside, he stiffened. After waiting some moments, Guyuan tapped the back of Shunyi's hand in confusion. Shunyi was an easygoing man. Aside from his half-hearted barking at Guyuan during their squabbles, it was rare for him to truly lose his temper. But now, as he sat still as stone beside Guyuan's bed, his hand holding the wooden bird shook. He drew in several harsh breaths as, with a sharp crunch, he crushed the little creature's neck in his grip. What the hell is this? Shunyi raged to himself. What the hell is this? Who are we sparing no effort and risking our lives for? What's the fucking point? Fearing some new trouble had arisen, Guyuan couldn't afford to dwell on his unseeing eyes. He forced his mouth open. What? His throat had been nicked by a piece of shrapnel that had narrowly missed his carotid artery. The wound overlapped neatly within the old scar that twisted over his neck, and although he wouldn't become mute like Liao Zhen, speaking was a struggle, his words wheezing out of him like a broken bellows. That bellows creaked out. Is the imperial court still determined to sue for peace? Shunyi's eyes were bloodshot. The Lingyuan Pavilion has sent a specialist to monitor the foreign affairs mission, he wrote into Guyuan's palm. They've discovered that a portion of the group is in secret contact with the Westerners. It seems a number of individuals whose identities cannot be verified have infiltrated the diplomatic mission. Guyuan breathed a sigh of relief. He struggled to shift his neck against the rigid steel plates. And here I thought something terrible had happened. Didn't they send us a list of everyone taking part of this expedition? Why would they suddenly add people to the group? If it's as you say, we can bar them from entering the garrison. Easy enough. We've just reported a major victory. There's no good reason for the foreign affairs mission to come to the front lines at all, Shunyi said. According to the letter, the delegation stopped in Pengcheng to await further instruction from His Majesty. Li Feng said it would be a pity for them to come all this way for nothing, so he ordered them to rest up in the city. When the court finishes allocating the latest round of military funding, the Foreign Affairs mission is to escort the supply convoy down to the front lines and... Guyuan raised a slender brow. Shunyi paused in agonized silence before writing into his palm, stroke by stroke. Reward the troops for their service. These words were practically taboo among veterans of the Black Iron Battalion. Guyuan visibly flinched before the steel panels lashed to his body forced him to stillness. Cold sweat slid down his temples. Zishi! Shunyi hurried to grab him. A coppery tang tore through the thick scent of medicine like a bright splash of color as red blood seeped from the bandages wrapped around Guyuan's chest. His complexion seemed to pale by comparison. He gave the impression that he was slowly evaporating into thin air, yet he stubbornly clung to consciousness. Despite everything, he was still trying to maintain his stoic facade in front of others. What was the use of glory and fame achieved by risking life and limb? Even if a hero's accomplishments were immortalized in history, he himself would amount to nothing more than a solitary name inscribed on a memorial tablet. Perhaps future generations of nobility would remember his deeds and cast him as the hero in a morality tale, or perhaps they would denounce him to display their own cynical erudition. As for the common people, they might memorialize him for spinning up fictitious scandals from hearsay or rearranging the rush plot of his life so that he haphazardly eloped some 100 times with every last one of his female acquaintances. No doubt his only luck with women would be his death. I'll write to Miss Chun immediately. Shun Yi was incandescent with anger. I'll escort you home. We can resign our posts together. You may as well kidnap His Highness while we're at it. Taking time to recover from your wounds or treating your illness, you can do whatever you want. To hell with the Lee family. Guyuan sighed and weakly squeezed his hand. Shun Yi's breathing was so ragged he could hardly speak. Unseen by Guyuan, his face was twisted in misery. But he didn't dare sob or gasp, lest Guyuan notice his trembling. He could only take shallow breaths through his mouth and let his tears drip helplessly onto his still armor. But how could Guyuan not notice? He didn't expose Shun Yi, but merely patted him lightly on the hand. It's no big deal, he said softly. You don't need to get so angry. Is there any news from Chang'eng? Yes, Shun Yi wrote into Guyuan's palm with shaking fingers. His Highness said you oughtn't worry about anything but the war, and to feel at liberty to slaughter any miscreant who comes to make trouble. He says even if the sky collapses over the capital, he'll be there to hold up the pieces. Guyuan laughed, the sound thinned by weakness. Blood loss had made him lightheaded. He had to pull all his focus into unraveling the main thread of this new development. The war hasn't yet been won, and they're already trying to bump me off. He coughed again weakly. Looks like there really has been a changing of the guard in the capital. Someone's resorted to desperate measures, but we're bound to meet the Westerners in battle at least once more. I can't leave the front lines now, so I can't offer him much assistance. Listen here. Let the foreign affairs missions into the garrison, then arrest them. Keep them under strict watch and cut off their communication with the capital. If the Westerners really are part of this plot, we can still turn their little trick against them. Shun Yi was silent. Qiping? Do you really think it's worth it? Guyuan started in surprise. Shun Yi flicked his gaze over the bloodstains on the marshal's chest before leaning closer to deliver his speech directly into Guyuan's deaf ears, every word deliberate. You're in here planning for the inevitable next clash with the Westerners while they're out there plotting your downfall. Do you think it's worth it? Of course, Guyuan's heart wasn't free of resentment. How could it be? But he had the misfortune of being accompanied by the short-fused Shun Yi. When they were together, no matter how either of them truly felt, one had to keep a cool head while the other flew off the handle. Shun Yi had nabbed the latter role, so Guyuan had no choice but to calmly accept the former. Well, was that lousy hair ornament you bought Miss Chun for 5 taels of silver worth it? Guyuan asked, his voice low. You knew you were getting ripped off, but you still went ahead and bought it. It's only right I lower myself a little for the sake of the woman I love, Shun Yi snapped. Why should I be embarrassed? But who are you debasing yourself for? Guyuan took his sweet time responding. They say even the most filial child struggles when faced with the prolonged illness of a parent. I've not even been ill that long. Unfilial bastard. You've learned to talk back to your betters. I see. Shun Yi was speechless. He'd served in the military with this man half his life. As many as the countless times Guyuan had considered quitting the army, too much were the times Shun Yi swore he'd never worry about this bastard again. He shook off Guyuan's hand and rose to leave. Die then, he thought. Qiping! Guyuan clawed fruitlessly at the air, missing his target. His fingers were covered in so many bandages and poultices they seemed nearly deformed, making it impossible for him to close his fist. This small movement exposed the clammy, scarred skin beneath those dreary bandages, and Shun Yi's heart lurched with discomfort. His white-hot anger dissipated in a puff of steam. Stop moving around, Shun Yi snapped. These next few days, Dongying is sure to send an envoy to negotiate with us in secret, Guyuan said, his voice faint. Chongzi is a civil official, so you need to... Shun Yi felt a spike of distress. Enough! I understand. Rather than lose his temper at being talked over, Guyuan burst into laughter. After wheezing a while, he said, "If I safeguard home and country and become the most famous general of my generation, the common people will worship me as a god and build temples in my name for centuries to come, subsisting on incense smoke. Now, there's a good life." Shun Yi scoffed. "What kind of god would you even be? We already have door gods. Don't tell me you want to be a window god? Or perhaps a bed god?" "I'll be whatever they like," Guyuan said with a chuckle. "It doesn't matter which temple people go to pray. The things they ask for are all the same, like to be promoted to get rich, or be blessed with a good marriage and a brood of kids." Shun Yi blinked. Riches, marriage, and children. Wasn't that the work of swindlers, matchmakers, and Guanyin Bodhisattva? Torn between grief and indignation, he couldn't stand this man's company for another moment. "Oh, great immortal Shun," Guyuan murmured, his voice thin as gossamer. "Please hand me the flute in the box on my nightstand." Sighing, Shun Yi picked up the little box from its place of honor beside Guyuan's pillow. Within lay a white jade flute, glowing with a subtle luster, atop a thick stack of billow paper. Beside it was a small collection of wind slashers inscribed with different names. The box seemed to contain all Guyuan's sentimental artifacts. "I won't die," Guyuan thought firmly to himself as he grasped the cold jade of the flute. "If they didn't manage to blow me up on that ship, then I won't die. Chang'e hasn't been cured of the Wu'erge, and there are so many people in the capital who want to hurt him. There's no way I could..." Could what? Before he could finish the thought, he tumbled once again into exhausted sleep. Thousands of kilometers away, the lamp still burned within the Fang estate deep in the night. Fang Qin sat in his room, his face grim as stagnant water. After a lengthy silence, he lifted his head and asked, "You're certain you heard this with your own ears?" The servant boy kneeling before him couldn't seem to stop trembling as he nodded rapidly. The current head of the Fang family lifted a hand to cover his face, his shoulders shaking. For a moment, it was difficult to tell whether he was laughing or crying. Fang Qin had once orchestrated a plot to lead Liu Chang down this very road. He had toyed with the thought that the ambitious Prince Yan might someday pursue this path as well. He had never imagined his own father would take to it first. The first time every scholar read the 4 doctrines of the philosopher Heng Qu Xianxiang in their youth, serve as conscience for heaven and earth, impart to the people correct ways of living, continue the imperiled scholarship of ancient sages, and establish an age of eternal peace, all felt passionately compelled to become an unparalleled statesman of their generation, one who could carry their nation for millennia on the strength of their accomplishments. But in the end, such passion was inevitably worn away by the temptations of rank, fame, and fortune, by the treacherous ways of the world and the simple passage of time. Those bright-eyed young scholars would spend the rest of their lives spinning their wheels as they went through the same stereotypical motions. History was filled with exceptional talents, but how many of them could be considered true statesmen? Fang Qin spent the rest of the night sitting listless in his study. The next morning, he instructed his most trusted servants to escort his wife and children quietly out of the capital. When the first rooster had crowed during the 4th night watch, for a moment, Fang Qin thought he would rush over to the Marquis estate, drag Prince Yan out of bed, and confess everything about the coup that was about to shake the capital. Yet despite staging this scene in his mind several hundred times as he waited for dawn, in the end, he couldn't do it. How difficult was it to be both the loyal subject and the filial son? It seemed he would never live to become a great and loyal statesman. In that case, he could only devote himself to the pursuit of the latter. 5 days later, a tantalizing rumor spread like wildfire through the capital and straight into the ears of every power-hungry conspirator. It seemed that, just a few days after the diplomatic mission turned supply escort arrived in the Liangjiang garrison, the entire camp had suddenly and inexplicably been placed under lockdown. Marshal Gu's status was unknown. Grand Secretary Fang, privy to slightly more detail, received a letter from one of his students containing a few simple strokes. "It is done." He exhaled slowly, his heart filling with indescribable excitement. To think things would go so smoothly. The greedy Westerners had helped him tremendously, and now, with the nation's military power out of the way, he could finally set in motion his glorious plans for a noble hegemony. At the same time, the Ministry of Rites suggested that the emperor make sacrifices to heaven, just as they had anticipated. Fang Qing took the lead in endorsing the proposal, and with Prince Yan's faction voicing no objection, the motion to indulge this rare extravagance passed with unanimous support. During the years of the Yuanhe era, the late emperor offered sacrifices often. The practice had fallen to the wayside thanks to the long-gone emperor's more frugal tendencies, but the logistical infrastructure still stood at the ready. To ensure they didn't ruffle any feathers while buttering Li Feng up, the Ministry of Rites had long begun preparing in secret. The moment the emperor gave the nod, they set to work without a moment's delay. When the day finally arrived, envoys from the northwest came to pay tribute one after another as fireworks dyed the sky in bright colors over the 9 gates. The restrictions on festivities had been lifted for the occasion, and the clamor of bells and drums filled the capital in a lively scene. The emperor was to leave the palace to make sacrifices to heaven, as well as report to his ancestors his achievements over the past year. Having learned his lesson during the last disastrous longevity festival, Li Feng left the unreliable civil and military officials of the court behind and brought along only the crown prince and 13 palace sentries. Prince Yan and the Grand Council led the rest of the courtiers to the base of the altar. After sacrificing to heaven and earth, paying respects to his ancestors, and performing a number of other meticulous rituals without mishap, Li Feng breathed a sigh of relief. He could finally dispel the unfortunate shadows cast by his previous outing. He ordered a return to the palace, with the imperial palanquin taking the lead. It was as palace sentries stepped up to replace the imperial guard outside the imperial city that the cry went up from the crowd. "Assassins!" The word was still ringing when a handful of Dongying shuriken sliced through the air. The little blades whipped through the crowd of officials, barely missing the sleeves of a Hanlin scholar, to embed themselves in a coldly gleaming row of dirt. The elderly scholar's eyes rolled back into his head, and he collapsed in a dead faint. The interior and exterior troops of the imperial city reacted as one. Some yelled, "Protect His Majesty!" while others shouted, "Apprehend the assassins!" Everyone stood aghast as an imperial guard turned and lunged toward the crown prince, blade held high. Chang'eng, being closest, dashed forward to grab the boy by his belt and dragged him back. From amid the chaos came another shout. "The imperial guard is rebelling!" The leader of the emperor's protective escort on this outing happened to be the captain of the imperial guard himself. Flabbergasted, he exclaimed, "Like hell we are!" Another man in the palace sentry's uniform pulled a miniature crossbow from its lapels and fired on Li Feng, who nearly fell out of his palanquin. The captain of the imperial guard thought to himself, "The palace sentries are the ones who are rebelling, but they're trying to use us as a scapegoat. Preposterous! Rebels have infiltrated the palace sentries. They're trying to assassinate His Majesty. Arrest them!" The imperial guard had been split into 2 divisions as a way to check each other's power, but communication between them was poor, and they now saw each other more as rivals than comrades. One group was primarily responsible for guarding the emperor's person, while the other was expected to support them and oversee the operation. The latter was obviously at a disadvantage. They did the same amount of work, but had no opportunity to display their skills before His Majesty. It was a recipe for dissatisfaction. The primary guard believed there were assassins hidden among the palace sentries, while the support guard suspected the primary guard of malicious intent. As for the palace sentries, they thought the imperial guard as a whole had risen in rebellion. The 3 parties descended into chaos. Guyuan had transferred nearly all the competent military leaders in the capital to various garrisons throughout the country, leaving behind only spineless cowards and dangerous conspirators to watch over the court. The area was quickly swallowed by pandemonium. Fang Qing's faction had been waiting for their cue. They swarmed Li Feng in a disorganized mob. "It's too dangerous here. Your Majesty, you must go." A group of unfamiliar guards followed in their wake. Fang Qing cried, "Your Majesty, please step down from your palanquin. We will protect Your Majesty with our lives." In his panic, Li Feng failed to notice any odd details. He grabbed Fang Qing's arm. "Where is the crown prince?" Fang Qing shot a look at one of the guards. "The crown prince's guard will keep him safe. Prince Yan was standing near him just a moment ago, but we were separated in the crowd. Your Majesty, please get to safety first. This subject will send someone to find him." Furious, Li Feng barked, "Summon the northern camp! These unruly traitors!" With a sharp nod, Fang Qing dispatched one of his men to go through the motions of relaying the imperial decree. They had planned this, too, in advance. Their success depended on quickly isolating the emperor from the palace sentries and the northern camp. As Fang Qing coaxed and urged Li Feng along, their own men in palace sentries' uniforms rushed forward as one. It took but a moment of distraction. By the time Li Feng realized what had happened, it was too late. On the front lines, the Pope received a report. Their spies in the Foreign Affairs mission reported that Great Liang's emperor had been overthrown. The supply convoy sent to the Liangjiang garrison was headed by a group of assassins who had reenacted the treacherous attack on the Black Iron Battalion in the northwest some 20 years ago. Gu Yun had suffered severe injuries. The man might very well be dead. The Liangjiang garrison had suppressed the news, but the camp was in chaos. It was the perfect opportunity for the Westerners to launch a counteroffensive. In the past, the Pope would never have believed this type of intelligence so easily. At the very least, he would have dispatched someone to verify the information. But he was running out of time. Great Liang's navy had broken two critical lines of communication with the Westerners' home nation, and while the conflict between rival factions within the Holy Empire was nearing its climax, a wave of rebellion had engulfed their formerly docile South Sea colonies. With so many fires springing up around them, the Western Navy had no choice but to take a long detour east through the Dongying archipelago. Truth be told, the Pope didn't trust the Dongying people as far as he could throw them. He had always felt they were like a pack of wild dogs liable to tear out their allies' throats the moment their back was turned. No one knew better than he that the Westerners' naval supremacy depended on the abundance of fuel. Without the large quantities of violet gold their ships required, the Western Navy was little more than a flotilla of scrap metal. As for Mr. Jia, he had unveiled a flawless new plan with great fanfare and dispatched an envoy to the shogunate in Dongying to ask for their cooperation. After welcoming their Western visitor with a round of sycophantic flattery, the shogun agreed to his request. He politely saw off his guest before returning to his residence and firmly shutting the door. No sooner had it closed than a travel-worn Dongying samurai slipped in through the rear entrance. He removed his jingasa and reported in a low voice, "I met with Marshal Gu." "Is he alive then? Wounded?" asked the shogun. "I cannot be certain. I saw him only briefly, and my status was too low to speak to him directly, but the garrison seemed well organized and packed with artillery. There was no evidence of disorder. If anything, they seemed ready to fight at a moment's notice. I saw no team of assassins either. If anyone truly made such an attempt, perhaps they've already been arrested in secret." "I understand. Good work." Chapter 126. Endgame, Part 3. The little crown prince's soul nearly fled from his body in terror as all hell broke loose around him. Disoriented, he clung desperately to Chang'eng's hand. The officials of the imperial court scattered as the two forces clashed, leaving the imperial palanquin collapsed in a heap on the ground. With the rabble out of the way, the miscreants narrowed in on their true target, launching toward Chang'eng and the crown prince. Minister Fang had instructed them thus: "Eliminate Prince Yan at all costs. If the opportunity presents itself, finish off the crown prince too." The assassins were pleased to find their targets clustered together, as though their prey had gone out of their way to make things easy. An arrow narrowly missed the top of the crown prince's head. Chang'eng grabbed the boy's scruff like a puppy and dragged him back. The child was so terrified he couldn't even cry out. He sobbed in wordless silence. Suddenly, he felt a hand wiping the tear tracks from his face. The crown prince looked up through misty eyes to see his fourth imperial uncle drying his tears. A moment later, Chang'eng lifted his hand to reveal a black iron cuff. A silk dart sprang from his sleeve, slicing through an assassin's wrist with ease. Chang'eng seized their would-be assailant's sword and, with a twist of his wrist and the screech of metal on metal, carved out a bloody path to escape. When I was your highness's age, I found myself surrounded by a pack of ravenous wolves outside the Great Northern Pass, Chang'e said, his voice steady. The land was covered in ice and snow, with not a soul in sight. The only thing I had on me was a little knife we country kids used as a toy, and the wolves chasing me weren't ordinary beasts either. They had been raised by barbarians for the sole purpose of hunting and killing humans. They were huge, even taller than me when standing. If there was one thing his enemies and allies could agree on, it was that Prince Yan was handsome of face and graceful of bearing. He wasn't ostentatious, the way most noble young masters who grew up in the capital were, nor was he spare like an impoverished scholar or rough-hewn like a decorated military veteran. He was exceptionally serene, but in a different way from Great Master Liao Zhen, whose placidity conjured images of a gently glowing oil lamp beneath the shadow of a Buddha. Rather, Prince Yan resembled the statue of a demonic fiend that stood inside a temple, cloaked in a desolate layer of incense ash, yet inspiring cold fear. Many had tried to imitate Prince Yan's calm and measured manner of speech over the years. None would have dreamed of associating him with a pack of starving wolves in the frontier lands north of the Great Wall. The little crown prince was stunned. A pair of assassins charged toward them. One hacked at the little crown prince in Chang'e's arms, while the other blocked his retreat. Chang'e sneered. He had grown up fighting the iron puppets of the Marquis estate. What did he have to fear from opponents of this caliber? With a sweep of his sword, Chang'e deflected the first assassin's blade. His opponent staggered as his weapon flew from his grip. He lifted his empty hands in a fruitless attempt to defend himself and was sliced neatly in two on the blade of Prince Yan's sword. Chang'e didn't pause. He darted 3 steps forward and, turning, used his momentum to fling his blade straight at the second assailant. Terrified, the man scrambled back, slamming into the sharp point of an incoming Imperial Guard spear. The little crown prince had never seen the Imperial cook kill a chicken, never mind the death of a man. Horrified, he flinched his eyes shut, but he couldn't stop the sickly sweet stench of blood from assaulting his nose, setting his stomach roiling with nausea. "Fourth uncle," he sniffled. "Don't be afraid," Chang'e said mildly. "The capable fighters are all either standing guard on our front lines or have already given their lives on the battlefield. As for these craven cowards, none have the ability to ride into battle and slaughter their enemies. The only thing they're good for is scaring children. Are you still a child?" "But I am a child," he thought, "but not for long." The spear-toting Imperial Guard who had dispatched the assassin called to them, "Your Highness, please follow me." The little crown prince turned to follow on instinct. Chang'e hooked his scabbard into the back of the boy's collar and yanked him aside. Before the crown prince could right himself, he was struck in the face by a splatter of hot blood. The man who had called out to them was cleaved in half as a heavy armor unit burst onto the scene. Elsewhere, Li Feng had finally realized he wasn't being escorted back to the palace, but was being led like a hostage toward a deserted area. His heart thudded in his chest as an inconceivable thought rose in him. He whipped his head around and demanded, "What's going on? Dear Subject Fang, where are you taking us?" Fang Qin did not pause in his footsteps, nor did he bow or kneel. In a ringing voice, he called, "Your Majesty, this subject would like to submit a memorial to the throne." Li Feng stared in disbelief. "What did you say? Stop! We said stop!" The pair of fake palace sentries flanking him paid him no mind as they grabbed him and dragged him along. "This subject wishes to impeach the only prince of the first rank of our nation, Prince Yan, Li Min," Fang Qing continued. "He has colluded with unscrupulous profiteers and used his war beacon tickets as pretext to shamelessly buy and sell official posts. This is his first crime. Despite being the son of His Majesty, the Yuanhe Emperor, he lacks filial piety and has shown no devotion to his late imperial father. Instead, to exert influence over our military, he spends his night in the Marquis estate and continues to call Marshal Gu his godfather, even after coming of age and receiving his princely title. He harbors nefarious intent and esteems neither father nor sovereign. This is his second crime." Li Feng would have had to be concussed to misunderstand what was going on. He exploded. "Fang Qin, what is the meaning of this?" Fang Qin's voice rose above his shouts. "Your Majesty, There are countless men waiting to ambush the conniving traitor. Though my allies and I are unskilled, we are willing to follow in the footsteps of the ancient sages. If the treacherous ministers cannot be checked, then they will be slain to free your majesty of their influence. To this I swear." His henchmen took up the cry,
"Slay treacherous ministers! Free his majesty of their influence!"
Li Feng was aghast. Looking around, all he saw were unfamiliar faces. The fake palace sentries, clad in stolen armor, watched him like tigers eyeing their prey, and the usual faces of his court looked to him like strangers. They were green-skinned, sharp-fanged demons in human skin, ready to swarm him in the next instant. So this was the bond between sovereign and subject. Was this how it was during the reign of Emperor Wu? Was this how it was during the reign of Yuan He Emperor? Perhaps he didn't hold a candle to the trailblazing Emperor Wu, but did he fall short of even his father, whom he had always, in his most private thoughts, found wanting? It was impossible for him to accept this as truth, yet no matter how unacceptable it was, it seemed to be so. After all, the Yuan He Emperor never suffered a siege on his capital, nor had wave after wave of rebels tried to claw him from the imperial throne. Li Feng had no time to register fear or anger. He felt as if he had been struck across the face without warning. In the 3,000 days since his ascension, he had yet to enjoy one peaceful night's sleep. And despite spending his every waking moment bustling about, what had he accomplished? In the end, he was no greater than the cowardly late emperor who had spent his days neck-deep in women, lamenting each turn of the seasons. There was nothing he could do. His confidence splintered away bit by bit, scattering like dust in the wind beneath the pitiless eyes of the rebel army. "How?" Li Feng shook from head to toe. "How dare you?" Fang Qin bowed his head, avoiding Li Feng's gaze. At this point, he knew he could no longer pretend to be a loyal minister. "Please forgive me, Your Majesty, but Li Ming deceives the masses, flouts the laws, and defies the will of our ancestors. Out of concern for the state of our nation, we are compelled to resort to this imperfect plan, for which we deserve to die 1,000 deaths. With Prince Yan's demise, the treasonous members of his faction running rampant in all corners of the nation will surely rise up. Please make your decision with haste and investigate this matter thoroughly, Your Majesty." Li Feng gnashed his teeth. "You dare threaten us?" Fang Qin sank to his knees, unfazed. "This lowly subject dares not. This lowly subject knows Your Majesty has suffered a great shock, and your mind is in a state of turmoil. The imperial edict has been drafted. You need only review it, Your Majesty." Someone presented the imperial edict to Li Feng with both hands. Sure enough, the document laid out a thorough analysis of Prince Yan's alleged crimes. All it lacked was the imperial jade seal. Shaking off the sentries gripping his arm, Li Feng lurched forward and grabbed the collar of the man holding the imperial edict, giving him a vicious shove. In his rage, he completely forgot about his weakened leg, which had never seen full recovery. He lost his footing and collapsed in a heap, failing to move the rebel even a jot. Under the watchful eyes of the heavens, he stood surrounded by his people, the people of Great Liang, yet no one stepped forward to help him. The real noble elites and false palace sentries looked on with cool eyes as the furious son of heaven toppled and fell flat on his rear. Someone in a palace guard's uniform, another impostor no doubt, jogged over. He glanced at Li Feng before turning to Fang Qin. "My lord, the traitors have been executed." Li Feng's knees turned to water. He sat on the ground, legs akimbo, and gritted down between clenched teeth. "And the crown prince?" The impostor looked at Fang Qin. Only after noting his subtle nod did the guard cautiously say, The crown prince was ambushed by assassins and, my condolences, Your Majesty." Li Feng's world seemed to flash white. An icy chill pierced his heart. By the time he regained his senses, he had choked up a mouthful of blood. Li Feng sat on the ground and stared at the thick black blood dripping from his fingers. "How have we fallen this far?" he wondered in a daze. Hesitation flickered over Fang Qin's face. Still on his knees, he instinctively reached out to help Li Feng up, only to pause with his hands outstretched. He retracted it, reluctance receding from his expression like the tide. When he spoke next, his voice was icy. Your Majesty has multiple sons. If the third prince is too young, there is the eldest prince, who is diligent, intelligent, and kind. For the sake of the nation, please calm yourself and recognize the most important matter at hand. He grabbed the imperial edict from his underling and shoved it in front of Li Feng once more. Please, Your Majesty. Li Feng knocked the fake imperial edict aside. Not on your life! Fang Qin silently rubbed at his cheek where the edict had left a mark as it whipped past. He leaned forward and sighed. Your Majesty, he began gently, you are at our mercy. Even if there were hundreds of soldiers outside the city walls, even if the northern camp comes, who would dare approach? Whether you will it or no, this imperial decree will be signed today. And what's wrong with the eldest prince? The subject hears that he is studious and reserved in temperament, the paragon of an imperial scion. He's no bastard of unknown origins like Prince Yan. He's a much more suitable representative of the Great Liang imperial family. Don't you agree? Pain lanced through Li Feng's chest. He felt frozen to the core, as though he had plunged into a lake of ice. He sucked in several sharp breaths, then sneered. And what comes after? Surely our dear subjects won't wait for us to settle accounts come autumn. What do you intend to do with us? Place us under house arrest? Or perhaps you'll execute us and be done with it? The Empress is frail and stays out of matters of state, and the eldest prince's entire maternal family was sentenced to death. He has no one to rely on, so he's the perfect puppet for you. You've certainly concocted the perfect plan. Fang Qin shook his head. Your Majesty, the Crown Prince has unfortunately departed this life. The traitor Li Min has also been executed. Of course, if you're willing, you could abdicate in the third prince's favor instead. But the third prince is so young, he hasn't even begun his schooling. Would you not be making a mockery of this nation passed down by your ancestors? Never would Fang Qin have imagined he would one day have the gall to speak to the emperor like this. The Confucian code of ethics imposed thousands of different rules on a person, all of which seemed unbreakable. But in reality, these commandments were not so strong as all that. Transgress their bounds just once, let go of one's sense of shame and honor, and the sky, it seemed, was the limit. The ground began to quake, pulling him back to the present. Everyone tensed. These were the orderly footsteps of a well-trained army. And judging from the tremors, there were heavy armor units among their number. Had the northern camp arrived? Fang Qin's heart tripped in his chest. This was a departure from their plan. Something had gone wrong. Making a snap decision, he waved his minions forward to seize Li Feng once again. I'm afraid I must ask your Majesty to bear this insult and accompany us on a brief excursion. Fake palace sentries surrounded Li Feng on all sides, forcing him along as they retreated from those pounding footsteps. Yet the moment they turned a corner, the imposter leading the way came to an abrupt stop. A group of real palace sentries waited up ahead. How did they manage to slip away from the crowd? No. Even if it happened sooner than expected, it was not surprising. The moment news of the attack reached the palace, the sentries would have turned out in full force. The more immediate question was, how had they so quickly found Li Feng? Fang Qin whipped his head around and scanned the group beside him. The scout who had come to report Prince Yan and the Crown Prince's deaths had disappeared. There was a traitor in their midst. More footsteps sounded from the direction they'd come. When he turned, he found that what had forced them into panicked flight wasn't heavy armor at all, but a team of iron puppets pressed into service from some nobleman's estate. Fang Qin was drenched in cold sweat. He knew at once that they had fallen into someone else's trap. But at this point, he no longer had the luxury of careful analysis. He grabbed Li Feng and pressed his blade to the emperor's fragile throat. Who dares take another step forward? The emperor was precious cargo. No one wanted to accidentally commit regicide. The palace sentries froze in place. Fang Qin gulped air through a dry throat, stunned by his own audacity. Not in his wildest dreams had he imagined himself capable of such disgraceful behavior. But before the sludge that was his mind could conjure up a countermeasure, the tardy imperial guard finally arrived on the scene in a raged mob. In the same instant, the shriek of a hawk echoed from beyond the 9 gates. The northern camp's armored hawks were requesting entrance into the aerial defense field. A dull thud sounded beside him. One of his co-conspirators had fallen to his knees in terror. Fang Qing gritted his teeth and turned to the long-gone emperor. "Please order them to stand down, Your Majesty." Battered and bruised as he was, Li Feng still managed to sneer. "Never." An arrow, shot from behind, grazed Fang Qing's shoulder. It was merely a scratch, but the searing pain of splitting skin made him flinch. The delicate balance shattered. Seizing his opportunity, Li Feng shoved Fang Qing away and broke into a run. But he was once again hobbled by his injury. The moment Li Feng stepped away, his leg gave out. He stumbled forward, flailing, and Fang Qing gave chase, instinctively thrusting his sword forward. Li Feng jerked violently, like a dying fish gasping on the shore. Face pale, Fang Qing let the hilt slip from his grip and staggered back, staring at the blade protruding from between Li Feng's shoulder blades as if seeing a ghost. The palace sentries, who had refrained from shooting for fear of harming the emperor, exploded into action. A child's tearful cry cut through the shouts of treacherous ministers. Li Feng struggled to his feet and saw the little crown prince rushing toward him. Not far behind him was Prince Yan, not a hair out of place. His younger brother met his eyes and slowed to a stop, gazing down at the miserable emperor in that uniquely calm way of his hands clasped behind his back. The palace sentries and imperial guard hurtled over in a noisy tangle and made quick work of the dazed courtiers who had risen in revolt. Li Feng was carried out of the crowd as the captain of the palace sentries wept and wailed before running off to summon the imperial physicians. Everyone knew in their hearts that it would be of no use. Stricken, the little crown prince laid his head against his father's chest and sobbed. Li Feng wanted badly to reach out and touch his tender young son. But before he could muster the strength, a hand landed on the crown prince's shoulder. Prince Yan stood silently at his side, stroking the boy's back to comfort him. In the eyes of outsiders, it seemed like a heartwarming scene of an uncle and nephew in mourning. Only Li Feng understood the threat concealed in Prince Yan's gesture. Li Feng stared fiercely into Prince Yan's tranquil eyes and recalled the rancorous words of his short-lived mother. "All barbarian women are wicked, and their bastard whelps are creatures of evil who will bring disaster upon country and people." This evil creature dropped to one knee, yet his hand remained on the crown prince's shoulder. "Does brother have any final instructions?" he asked quietly. You... Prince Yan lowered his voice further and whispered deliberately into his ear. "Don't worry. As your subject and brother, I'll take good care of the crown prince." Li Feng's lips trembled. A fire seemed to burn in his eyes, but slowly, as his life drew to a close, that flame dimmed and died. He reached out a shaking hand, caught in midair by Prince Yan. So even hands as cold as theirs could simulate the warmth of brotherly love. The ministers who had been scattered by the rebel army had finally managed to rush over like a flock of stampeding sheep. At an angle unseen by bystanders, Prince Yan smiled softly at Li Feng. When he spoke, however, his voice was steeped in sorrow. "Brother, have you any last words?" The little crown prince was crying so hard he couldn't stand up. Li Feng glanced at him, then gently closed his eyes. He had never known the meaning of the word compromise and been tough and unyielding throughout his life. To think he'd meet his end like this, surrounded by traitors and conspiracies, his son yet childish and unfledged, with no one to support him on the throne. "We have spent our entire life toiling for this nation," he began, his voice a whisper. Realizing what he meant to say, the scholars of the Imperial Censorate and the Department of Supervision, as well as the Emperor's palace attendants, stopped their crying and rushed forward to listen with bated breath, fearful of missing even one of the Emperor's halting words. Li Feng's eyes seemed to shimmer with tears as he continued. "We look toward our citizens arrayed under heaven and feel shame. In the past 10 years, we were so troubled. We struggled to sleep. A century from now, But the Crown Prince is still young. He cannot shoulder such heavy burdens. Chang'eng turned slightly and glanced toward the troop of iron puppets standing in the distance, beyond the edge of the crowd. Among those lifeless armored monsters, one watched him with gentle eyes. It had once been his sparring partner, a constant companion who'd helped him carry his breakfast all the countless times he woke before dawn to knock on a certain marquis's door. Its eyes flickered with a faint purple glow, as if someone far away on the front lines gazed at him calmly through the eyes of this lifeless iron giant. "We declare Prince Yan our heir. He will succeed our throne. May he carry on the will of our ancestors." In the 10th year of Longan, on the first day of the 3rd month, the Longan Emperor Li Feng met his end at the hands of a treacherous minister. In an astonishing turn of events, before passing on, he skipped over the crown prince and declared that he would pass the throne to his brother, Prince Yan. Prince Yan dealt with the mutinous nobles with brutal efficiency, tearing some of the most influential families in the capital up by their roots. Wielding this legitimate excuse, he cut a bloody swath through the imperial court. The Grand Council unveiled 3 new decrees overnight, stabilizing court and capital with a firm hand. But before Jiang Chong and his colleagues could go through the motions of convincing him to take up the role in earnest, Prince Yan, now their nation's emperor-to-be, left the capital without warning. If not for the fact that the Grand Council had experienced every sort of tumult up to this point and could withstand even the sky falling, the court would have exploded into chaos once more. Before taking off, Chang'eng summoned Jiang Chong and walked him through the logistics of delegating all his responsibilities point by point, then handed him a box filled with imperial decrees he had written in advance. His heart was like an arrow knocked to the string, eager to take flight. Given the state of the war in Jiangnan, Jiang Chong had recognized the possibility that Chang'eng might soon depart the capital. But he never expected him to vanish so suddenly, and was shocked when word reached him the next day. Overnight, Chang'eng sped to the northern camp and borrowed a team of armored hawks to serve as his personal guard, intending to fly directly south. He was certain something had happened in Liangjiang. Whether it was Cao Chunhua, whom he had sent to watch over Gu Yuan, the 2 undercover agents from the Lingyuan Pavilion who had infiltrated the Foreign Affairs mission, or even Gu Yuan himself, their letters were all suspiciously optimistic about the situation on the front lines, filled with reassurances that they would soon be in a position to recover Jiangnan. It was abnormal. Gu Yuan he expected to sweep bad news under the rug, but the point of the Lingyuan Pavilion, noted right in the organization's name, was that its members were expected to conduct their investigations as if approaching the abyss, treading with utmost caution while marking the subtlest details. Even if they really had achieved an overwhelming victory over the Westerners as the reports claimed, they ought to still consider all potential risks and meticulously relay their findings to both Gu Yuan and the master of the Lingyuan tablet in the capital. Yet they hadn't reported a word. It was beyond strange. Chang'eng had carried out his plan in the capital methodically and with apparent ease, but in reality, toward the end, he could hardly sit still thinking of what might have happened in the south. But he couldn't leave to see Gu Yuan at such a critical juncture. There were too many variables, and he wouldn't know until the very last moment whether he would succeed. If the unexpected happened, there was a significant possibility he would have to pick up his sword with his own 2 hands and bear the ignominious title of traitorous scoundrel and kinslayer. Throughout it all, he couldn't afford to involve himself with Gu Yuan in any way. He'd had no choice but to leave Gu Yuan on the front lines where he couldn't see him. It was impossible for an armored hawk to fly all the way to Jiangbei without stopping to rest. And so it was while Chang'eng was waiting impatiently for his team to refuel at the military relay station that the red-tagged emergency dispatch arrived from Liangjiang. The commander of the northern camp promptly intercepted the dispatch and presented it to Chang'eng. In a brazen move, the Western Navy had readied their fleet within Dongying waters and launched a frenzied counterattack. Woo! Lord, Lord, Lord! These chapters were so jam-packed. Also, I'm sorry for an extremely long video if you consider 2-hour videos long. It's rare that I do 2 hours plus videos. But anyway, wow. These past few chapters just... Okay, let's just go ahead and get right into it. I'm going to work my way backwards. Wow. I'm sorry. Chang'e. I knew it. I just knew it. I knew this man was just waiting, biding his time until he could finally get rid of the emperor. I didn't know how it was going to come, especially since, I'm not really all that politically savvy and everything, but I knew it because I have remembered so many instances throughout the books where you could see his hatred for just like the Lee family in general. Like, remember that one time where in his mind, it was a thought that he said he was going to get rid of the entire Lee family. And then when Guyun was put in the dungeon, he had looked back at the Imperial Palace with like the most seething, hateful look in the world. Like he was just gonna murder them. And I just remember those moments and I was like, okay, I don't know how Chang'e is going to go about accomplishing the things that he wants to accomplish, but I never forgotten his hatred toward Li Feng and what he was going to do. Now, my only thing is, which I don't think he will, because I know originally he said he was going to wipe out the entire Li family, even though, like, dude, you're a part of that. But I'm believing that he will just raise up the crown prince and not get rid of him as well. Like, come on, you can totally do that. Yeah, turn him around the way you want him, mold him into the way you want him to be. But anyway, let's move on to the next subject. Okay, so the people that set up this next rebellion, which, God, Li Feng really did face a lot of rebellions. They are dumb as hell. How in the world did they allow themselves to stupidly underestimate Chang'e? He is Gu Yuan's, Gu Zixi's godson, for crying out loud. How dare you disrespect him and think that he can just barely shoot an arrow and that's it? Do you have any idea who you're talking about? I got offended reading that. Like, who the hell are you? Let me calm down. What is this next thing? Oh yeah. Going back. So, you know what? If I ever had to like choose a position of power to be in, it would never be an emperor. Because it just sounds so freaking taxing. I mean, like, you think you are the one in power, but if your people are dissatisfied, you quickly realize just how much not in power you are. Because all of those people that are doing the inner workings and having their own factions and everything, and traitors and old geezers who are unhappy, they will turn against you and try to push you. They'll try to force you while saying they're not forcing you to do exactly what it is they want you to do. That just, like, I just don't want to be the emperor. It sounds like too much work. So you know what? Good for Li Feng. He's finally getting a good night's sleep. It's just gonna be eternal. Unless, the whole reincarnation thing, but whatever. Another thing I wanted to mention, just because I feel like this is the 3rd or 4th time it's been mentioned throughout the series since it was first said, and that is the lesson that Chang'e has held onto from Guyun, and that is the one in battle, the one who clings to his life is the first to die. It reminds me of the scripture in the Bible where it says, those who love their lives lose it. And I just thought that was quite interesting to see basically that proverb in a different sense. And, well, yeah, that was it. Okay, going to the next thing. Does anyone else think that Guyun at war is just so freaking sexy? He's so badass. Oh my God. Just like the way he was handling everything and like smirking and like it's all good and whatnot. And just so, God, he's so lethal. That is sexy. And it's just crazy because like with my husband, he already knew beforehand, which why would I be interested in someone who wants to do these things? But I told my husband, I was like, look, you can't be a police officer. You can't be in the army unless, it's forced by the government. You can't be a firefighter or anything of the sort because anything could happen even to just a regular everyday person that works at Walmart. But I want to know for sure that you're gonna return home safely. But like reading about Guyun, I ain't gonna lie, it's pretty cool. It's pretty sexy. So, wow. Okay. And then the last thing that I want to say, which I should have said in the last video, but it's neither here nor there, is I'm really happy that there is actually a cure for the wuarge, and I can't wait to see how the full healing process goes. I hate that he has to, endure the pain that he did endure in this session. I wonder, like, how many sessions of those he has to have. But anyway, very, very happy. I'm hoping that Guyun is okay. Like for real, and I'm hoping that he can get something back, some of his sight and some of his hearing, even if it's not as good, because let's just be realistic, even though, these scenarios aren't always based in reality. He's been through a lot, physically speaking, so it's understandable if his sight and hearing won't ever return to what they used to be or what they could have been if he were never poisoned in the first place. But I'm really hoping that Chun Ching Shu can do something for him. So, okay, I feel like I've talked myself dry. That is it for today's video. There are 2 chapters left that will be done separately before we are officially in the extras. And you guys, I am really trying to plow through these so that we can finish by the 28th of February. So let's do the doggone thing, shall we? If you have any thoughts, please put them in the comments. I cannot wait to interact with you all, and I will see you next time. 我爱你们